My 10-year-old granddaughter returned from her paternal uncle's office after a career day experience. The moment she walked through the door, she trembled and said, "Uncle said my hands were too clumsy, and he made me wear this to look sophisticated." It was a pair of pale pink silk gloves. When I slid them off, I saw her tiny wrists covered in heavy pressure marks, and the silver keepsake bracelet from her late father was gone. It had been forcefully taken from her. I didn't call the police. I didn't message anyone. I drove straight to my eldest son's mansion, and the moment he opened the door, I took action. This story starts quietly, but it builds to something you won't forget. Before we begin, drop a quick comment and let me know what's the weather like where you are right now. Your presence here truly means a lot. Quick note, some details have been adjusted for storytelling purposes. What matters most is the lesson and the message it carries. The first week of November in Chicago announces itself without ceremony. No single morning tells you summer is over. It simply stops arriving. And one day the light through the kitchen window comes in flat and pale, and you understand that the warmth is not returning for a long time. I noticed it on a Thursday. Cleo had left for school 40 minutes earlier, and I was still at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, going cold, watching the elm outside lose its last amber leaves to a wind that hadn't been there the day before. Nothing required my attention. No encrypted messages, no evidence folders, no federal timelines counting down toward a Saturday that had come and gone 3 years ago. The quiet used to feel like danger. Now it felt like something I was slowly learning to inhabit. I'd been retired for 7 years before Hugo attacked Cleo, and in those 7 years I'd never fully settled into the stillness of a life without deadlines. Former auditors don't retire easily. The habit of looking for the discrepancy, the number that doesn't match the signature that sits slightly wrong on the page, doesn't dissolve when the employment ends. I'd filled those 7 years with Cleo's school pickups and architectural sketches spread across the kitchen table, and the low maintenance of a house I'd lived in long enough that it required attention, the way old things do not. Urgency, just steady care. Then came the pink gloves and the stillness shattered, and for 7 days I'd moved through the world with the particular focus of a man who understands that every hour counts differently than the one before it. The stillness now was different from the stillness before, inhabited rather than endured. I brought the coffee to the sink, rinsed the cup, and drove to the Lincoln Square Community Center where I'd been volunteering for 4 months. The financial literacy program met on Tuesday and Thursday mornings in a room that smelled of floor wax and old upholstery, the kind of institutional space that exists in every neighborhood and gets taken for granted by everyone who doesn't need it. 12 participants that session, ages ranging from 23 to 71, backgrounds ranging from recent immigrants navigating their first American tax return to a retired teacher trying to understand why her pension statements never quite added up the way she expected. I'd found the program through Lyle, who sat on the community center's board, and had mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, as a statement of fact with a clear implication attached. They need someone who knows financial documents, he'd said. Someone patient. Someone who doesn't make people feel stupid for not knowing what they were never taught. I'd started the following week. What I hadn't anticipated was how much the work would require me to see financial documents the way a civilian saw them, not as puzzles to be solved or frauds to be detected, but as unfamiliar language in which consequential decisions were encoded. A lease agreement, a credit card disclosure, a medical billing statement with 14 line items and a total that bore no obvious relationship to the services listed. A woman named Patricia, 68, a retired postal worker, had spent 40 minutes one Tuesday morning trying to explain why her bank statement showed a charge she didn't recognize. She kept apologizing for not understanding it faster. I kept telling her there was nothing to apologize for. The statement was designed to be difficult to read, and recognizing that wasn't stupidity, it was accuracy. "My grandson says I should just use the app," she said. "Your grandson isn't wrong," I said. "But you should also know how to read the statement, because the app can be wrong too, and you need to be able to catch it." She laughed, a short, surprised sound, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to be taken seriously. "You sound like my father," she said. "He always said the most dangerous thing was assuming someone else understood it for you." "Your father was right," I said. I thought about that exchange on the drive home that Thursday, about the elm outside my kitchen window, about Cleo asking me last week why architects needed to understand structural engineering when they had engineers for that. I'd told her the same thing I'd told Patricia, because you need to be able to catch the error, and you can only catch what you understand. She'd written it in the margin of her sketchbook, the way she wrote things she intended to remember. The design review results arrived by email that evening while I was making dinner. Cleo's community health facility project had placed first in the Chicago Architecture Foundation's youth program, Autumn Cohort. The email was formal and brief, the language of institutional commendation, outstanding, technical execution, exceptional structural reasoning, innovative accessibility approach. Below the official language, her mentor, Clara Shen, had added a personal note. She argued for the entrance ramp as primary access with more clarity and conviction than half the licensed architects I've worked with. Scholarship consideration forthcoming. I printed the email and left it on the kitchen table where Cleo would find it when she came home. She found it at 6:15, still in her coat canvas bag over one shoulder. She read it standing at the table without sitting down. I watched her face from the stove, the careful stillness of someone reading slowly to make sure they understand what the words actually say, not what they hope they say. She set the paper down. She looked at me. "First place," she said. "First place," I confirmed. She sat down then, slowly, the way people sit when something has settled into them and they need a moment before they can speak about it comfortably. Her coat was still on. Her bag was still on her shoulder. She looked at her hands, both of them palms up, the faint, pale lines across the right wrist, catching the kitchen light the way they always did in certain angles. "I designed the ramp first," she said. "Everything else came after it." Clara said most students add accessibility features at the end. She said designing from inclusion outward changes the whole structure. "It does," I said. "I learned that from you." She looked up. "Not the architecture part, the other part. Starting from the person who has the hardest time and making sure the whole system works for them. You did that when you built the case. You started from the most vulnerable point, me, and built outward." I turned back to the stove so she wouldn't see my face. The onions didn't need attention, but I gave them some anyway, keeping my hands occupied while I found the right words. "You gave me the reason to start anywhere at all," I said finally. She didn't respond immediately. I heard the chair shift, the quiet sound of her bag being set down, her coat being removed and draped over the chair back. When I turned around, she was at the table with her sketchbook, open pencil in hand, the printed email beside her like a document requiring a response. "I want to write back to Clara," she said, "to say thank you properly, not just reply to the email." "Then write a letter," I said. "A real letter." "She left you a personal note. A reply-all email isn't the same thing." Cleo considered this with the seriousness she brought to decisions that seemed small but weren't. Then she nodded and opened to a fresh page in the sketchbook, not for drawing, just for drafting. She wrote the date at the top in careful script. Below it, "Dear Ms. Shen." I set dinner on the table, and she kept writing, pausing occasionally to cross out a word and replace it with one that fit better. Outside the kitchen window, the elm stood bare against the November dark, holding its shape without its leaves, patient, in the way that things are patient when they've survived long enough to understand that seasons return. We ate around her drafting the way we'd always eaten around her drawings. After dinner, she read the letter aloud to me, 2 paragraphs precise and warm, saying exactly what she meant, without ornament. She asked if it sounded right. I told her it sounded like her, which was better than sounding right. She sealed it in an envelope and addressed it in her careful 13-year-old script, the same script that had signed a trust document 2.5 years ago, wobbly and deliberate, staking her name to something that would outlast whatever had tried to diminish it. I watched her press the envelope flat against the table and thought about what it meant to build something that held, not because it had been designed for strength alone, but because it had been designed honestly, from the foundation outward, accounting for every weight it might one day be asked to carry. The kitchen was quiet. The letter was sealed. The sketchbook lay open to a fresh page. That was enough for tonight. I pulled Cleo close, careful of her wrists, and took 3 slow breaths. The pliers marks were evidence. The missing bracelet was evidence. Hugo's knowledge of the scholarship was evidence. 40 years as an auditor had taught me one thing: document everything before you act. I sat Cleo down on the living room sofa and asked her to tell me everything, starting with what Hugo meant about what she'd won. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I won the Global Fund Scholarship, Grandpa. The letter came 3 days ago. It's for architecture students." The Global Fund. One scholarship awarded nationally each year to students under 18 who showed exceptional architectural promise. The prize included $50,000 and a mentorship program with some of the best architects in the world. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked gently. "The letter said not to tell anyone yet. They need to do an in-person interview first to make sure the work is really mine. It's scheduled for next Thursday." Her voice dropped to a whisper. Uncle Hugo checked the results online. His son Tristan entered too, but Tristan was disqualified. Disqualified for what? The judges said he copied someone else's design. Plagiarism. Cleo looked down at her hands at the marks on her wrists. Uncle Hugo was so angry when he called me this morning. He said we needed to celebrate Tristan's achievement, but then when I got there, he asked about my drawings. He already knew I'd won. He said if I can't hold a pencil steady for the interview next Thursday, they'll give it to someone else. The room tilted slightly. This wasn't a spontaneous act of cruelty. This wasn't even about the bracelet. Hugo had planned this. He'd checked the scholarship results, discovered his son was disqualified for cheating while his niece won legitimately, and orchestrated an entire fake career day to sabotage a 10-year-old child's future. Did he say anything else? He said Tristan worked so hard. He said it wasn't fair that I got special treatment just because my dad died. Her voice cracked. He said my hands were clumsy and I didn't deserve nice things. I stood up slowly. The rage that had been building since I saw the gloves crystallized into something cold and focused. Stay here, I said. Lock the door after I leave. Don't answer it for anyone except me. Where are you going? To get your bracelet back. I should have stopped. I should have called the police, photographed her wrists, filed a report. I should have used the 40 years of methodical investigation training that had made me successful. But I didn't. I drove 20 minutes to Hugo's Gold Coast mansion with a golf club from my garage sitting on the passenger seat. The rage overrode everything else. My son had tortured my granddaughter. My son had stolen her father's memorial. My son had tried to destroy her future because his own son was a plagiarist. This wasn't an accident during a career day. This was calculated sabotage of a 10-year-old child's future. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings I refused to hear. I pulled into the circular driveway at 7:45. Hugo's vintage Porsche sat gleaming under the mansion's exterior lights. $300,000 worth of restored German engineering, his pride and joy. The front door opened before I even got out of the car. Hugo stood on the marble steps, phone in hand, smiling. His wife Saskia stood beside him, 30 years old, wearing an emerald silk dress, her expression carrying that practiced superiority she reserved for family she considered beneath her social status. Dad, Hugo called out cheerfully. I'm so glad you came by. The cameras are all working perfectly tonight. I looked up. Every exterior security camera was positioned to cover the driveway. The little red recording lights blinked like warning signals I was too angry to heed. Give me her bracelet, I said. I don't know what you're talking about. Hugo's smile widened. But please feel free to express yourself. We have excellent video quality and high definition. I pulled the golf club from my car. Should we call the police now? Saskia asked Hugo, her voice carrying theatrical concern. Or wait until he's completely destroyed it. Let's give him time, Hugo said. I want good footage. I used the golf club to break the Porsche's windshield. Glass scattered across the driveway as I let the built-up emotion damage his prized vehicle. Hood panels dented and side windows broke under the impact while Hugo stood on his steps recording every single detail on his phone. That's perfect, Father, he called out. Very stable, very rational, exactly the kind of man who should have custody of a 10-year-old child. The words cut through the rage like ice water. I stopped mid-swing and looked up. Hugo held his phone steady, the red recording light still blinking. Behind him, Saskia had her own phone out, also recording. Thank you, Hugo said, his voice dripping with false gratitude. The cameras recorded everything, violent, unstable, dangerous, exactly what I needed. I stood among the shattered glass and twisted metal, my hands still gripping the golf club. Every security camera pointed at me, 2 phones recording, 1 destroyed Porsche that probably cost more than my house. I had just given my son everything he needed to destroy me. Not just evidence of property damage, evidence of violent, uncontrolled behavior, evidence that I was dangerous, evidence that could be used in any custody hearing, any legal proceeding, any attempt to remove Cleo from my care. Hugo had hurt my granddaughter. And when I reacted exactly as he'd predicted, he'd been waiting with cameras to document my rage. I'll have my insurance company send you the bill, Hugo said pleasantly. Though I'm more interested in showing this to family services, I'm concerned about Cleo living with someone so volatile. He stepped back into his mansion and closed the door, leaving me standing in his driveway, surrounded by evidence of my own stupidity. I'd spent 40 years learning to read balance sheets, to stay calm during audits, to never show emotion in a boardroom. And I just destroyed all of that in 5 minutes of uncontrolled rage. I dropped the golf club and walked back to my car. My hands were shaking, not from anger anymore, from the cold realization of how badly I'd miscalculated. Hugo hadn't just attacked Cleo, he'd set a trap. And I'd walked into it exactly as he'd planned. I drove home in silence, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Hugo had the video. Hugo had the cameras. Hugo had everything he needed to prove I was violent and unstable. But giving him that footage was a mistake I could fix if I stopped reacting with rage and started thinking like an auditor. The first thing I did when I got home was open my email. If Hugo targeted Cleo's hands to sabotage something she won, I needed to know exactly what. Cleo sat on the sofa where I'd left her, still wearing the pink gloves. I told her to keep them on until we got to the hospital. Evidence. I opened my laptop in the study and searched through the spam folder for anything related to the Global Fund. There, buried under promotional emails, a message with the subject line Global Fund Architecture Award. Immediate attention required. The email was dated 3 days ago. Dear Mr. Mercer, we are pleased to confirm that Cleo Mercer has been selected as this year's Global Fund Architecture Scholarship recipient. The award includes a mentorship program and $50,000 to support her education. However, we must inform you of an unusual incident. 3 days ago, we received an aggressive call from someone identifying themselves as a Vance family representative demanding we rescind the award. The caller claimed Miss Mercer's work was plagiarized and that she was ineligible due to family connections. We declined and have documented this attempted interference. Please contact Director Diana Prince to schedule Cleo's required in-person verification interview. I read it 3 times. Hugo had called the fund 3 days before he invited Cleo to his office. 3 days before the career day. 3 days to plan how to sabotage her hands so she couldn't draw during the interview. This wasn't rage. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was premeditated destruction of a child's future. I opened another browser window and pulled up the financial databases I still had access to from my auditing days. If Hugo was desperate enough to torture his niece over a scholarship his son lost, something was driving that desperation. It took me 40 minutes to find it. The Vance Luxury Tower project wasn't just behind schedule. It was drowning in debt. 3 major Chicago banks had extended loans totaling over $40 million, double the project's publicly announced value. The construction permits showed significant delays. The material orders showed cost overruns. And buried in the corporate filings was a series of Delaware shell companies receiving fund transfers that didn't match any legitimate construction expenses. $40 million, I said aloud to my empty study. My son is completely underwater. The scholarship wasn't about Tristan losing. It was about Hugo needing Cleo to fail so dramatically that the Vance family name looked strong in comparison. He needed to prove his branch of the family was superior while he was secretly hemorrhaging money. I'd made one mistake tonight, letting rage override 40 years of professional discipline. I wouldn't make another. I closed the laptop and walked back to the living room. Cleo looked up at me with red eyes. We're going to the hospital, I said. Why? Because those marks on your wrists need to be documented by a doctor. And because I'm not going to let Hugo get away with this. Chicago Memorial Hospital's pediatric emergency room at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night was quieter than I'd expected. A few parents with sick children, one teenager with a basketball injury, and us. The intake nurse took one look at Cleo's wrists when I carefully removed the gloves and immediately flagged us as priority. Dr. Celeste Ross, 45. The pediatric specialist on duty that night examined Cleo's wrist with the careful precision of someone who'd seen too many injuries that didn't match the stories. Tell me exactly how this happened, Dr. Ross said, her voice gentle but firm. I let Cleo explain. Every word. The career day invitation, Hugo's questions about the scholarship, the pliers from the construction site, the missing bracelet, the forced wearing of gloves all day. Dr. Ross's expression didn't change, but her pen moved faster across the medical chart. Mr. Mercer, she said when Cleo finished, these marks are consistent with pressure from industrial pliers. This wasn't a household accident. My son did this to sabotage her scholarship interview, I said. She has to draw architectural designs in person next Thursday. He damaged her hands deliberately. Dr. Ross photographed the injuries from multiple angles, measured the marks, documented every detail. The tissue damage is superficial, but the pattern is unmistakable. Commercial-grade tool applied with significant force. She paused, looking directly at me. I need you to understand, this medical record won't disappear. I'm required by Illinois law to report suspected child abuse, and I will. For the first time since Cleo walked through my door wearing those gloves, I felt something other than rage or horror. I felt hope. Please do, I said. Dr. Ross nodded. Child Protective Services will contact you within 48 hours. They'll conduct their own investigation. In the meantime, keep those gloves as evidence. Don't wash them. Don't touch the pliers if you can locate them. Photograph everything. She handed me a printed copy of the medical report stamped and signed. Official, permanent, documented. What about the interview? Cleo asked quietly. Can I still draw? Dr. Ross examined her hands carefully. The tissue will heal. You'll have some tenderness for a few days, possibly some bruising that will last through next week, but structurally your hands are fine. You'll be able to write and draw." Cleo looked at me, and for the first time since this started, I saw something other than fear in her eyes. I saw determination. We left the hospital at 12:45 Sunday morning. I had a medical report in my hand. I had photographs of the injuries. I had documentation of Hugo's premeditated interference with the scholarship. And I had made my first smart move since this began, prioritizing evidence over emotion. The hospital corridors faded behind us as we stepped into the cool night air. I held the signed medical report tightly against my chest, knowing that Dr. Ross's official findings had now given us our first real shield against Hugo's upcoming moves. I nodded slowly, feeling the first piece of solid ground under my feet since Cleo walked through my door wearing those pink gloves. Hugo had his video of me destroying his car, but I had medical proof of what he'd done to a child. The question now was which evidence would matter more. Hugo had video evidence of property destruction. I had medical proof of child abuse. But evidence only mattered if I understood the full scope of what I was fighting. A good auditor never presents findings without a complete picture. The fireproof filing cabinet in my study held 40 years of financial records. If Hugo was desperate enough to attack a child, he was desperate enough to steal. I made coffee while Cleo slept upstairs. Sunday morning at 2:30 a.m., and I was wide awake with Dr. Ross's medical report on my desk and a question burning in my mind: where was Hugo getting his money? The tower project was hemorrhaging cash. The banks were demanding payments, and Hugo was living in a Gold Coast mansion with a vintage Porsche in the driveway. I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out folders I hadn't touched in a decade. Property deeds, trust documents, family business records, and buried at the bottom a folder labeled Consulting Projects 2015. The Vance Luxury Tower site had been an empty lot before Hugo took over the development. 10 years ago, before the project started, I'd been hired as a consultant to install the building management software infrastructure. Heating, cooling, security systems, elevator controls, everything that would eventually run the building. I'd set up the administrative accounts, tested the systems, and walked away when the contract ended. I opened my laptop and navigated to the building management login portal. The website still existed unchanged after all these years. I tried my old credentials, vmercer_admin, the password I'd used for every consulting contract back then. The screen flickered. Welcome, Administrator Vernon Mercer. Last login, November 12, 2015. 10 years. 10 years, and they'd never deleted my account. I had master administrative access to every digital system in the building Hugo was developing. Cameras, door locks, security logs, temperature controls, everything. I stared at the dashboard for 30 seconds, my finger hovering over the mouse. This was a weapon, a massive, powerful weapon that Hugo didn't know existed. But I couldn't use it yet, not until I understood what I was attacking. I logged out without touching anything and closed the laptop. Not yet, I said to my empty study. I need to know what I'm looking at first. I turned back to the filing cabinet and pulled out the family trust documents. My grandfather had established the Vance Family Trust in 1965, consolidating land holdings across Chicago's North Side. The trust was supposed to distribute income equally among all descendants, with land sales requiring unanimous beneficiary approval. I spread the documents across my desk and began reading with the methodical precision that had made me successful for 40 years. By 4 a.m., I'd found the first irregularity. 3 companies receiving management fees before any distribution to beneficiaries: Apex Holdings, Blue Ridge Consulting, Summit Management. All 3 incorporated in Delaware, all 3 sharing the same registered agent address. I'd spent 40 years hunting corporate fraud for other people's families. I never thought I'd be hunting it in my own. I cross-referenced the Delaware business registrations against every document in the cabinet. Property transfers, management contracts, banking authorizations. It took me an hour to find the connection. The registered agent address for all 3 Delaware companies matched a business filing from 2019, Saskia's maiden name, Saskia's family business address. Not Hugo acting alone. Hugo and Saskia together, using her family's corporate infrastructure to create shell companies that could legally receive trust funds before any legitimate beneficiary saw a dollar. I kept digging. By 6 a.m., I'd documented the pattern. Over the past 5 years, the 3 shell companies had received over $20 million in management fees from trust properties. None of that money appeared in the trust's distribution records. None of it had been reported to the other beneficiaries. But that wasn't the worst of it. I found property transfer documents dated over the past 3 years. Prime commercial parcels in Lincoln Park, Lakeview, and the loop land my grandfather had bought in the 1960s that was now worth millions. All transferred from the family trust into Hugo's personal ownership, using authorization documents that bore signatures I knew were forged. My grandfather's signature, my late wife's signature. even my own signature on a document dated 6 months after I'd allegedly authorized the transfer. Hugo wasn't just skimming management fees, he was stealing the land itself. Piece by piece, parcel by parcel, he was dismantling the family trust and transferring everything into his name alone. And Saskia's family was helping him do it. I pulled up the construction loan documents I'd found the night before. The tower project's debt load made sense now. Hugo needed cash flow to maintain his lifestyle while the embezzlement played out. The tower was supposed to be his legitimate triumph, the proof that he was a successful developer who'd earned his wealth. Instead, it was drowning him in debt he couldn't repay without stealing more from the family trust, which explained why Cleo's scholarship win had triggered such desperation. If Hugo's son Tristan won, it would prove the Vance family's superiority while Hugo secretly looted the trust. But if Cleo won the orphan granddaughter being raised by the dismissed elder, it would highlight everything Hugo was trying to hide. So he'd attacked her hands, tried to destroy the scholarship. And when I'd reacted with rage, he documented my violence to use as leverage. I leaned back in my chair as Sunday morning light started filtering through the study windows. The medical report from Dr. Ross sat on my desk beside the trust documents. The building management login credentials were saved on my laptop. The evidence of Delaware shell companies and forged land transfers filled 3 folders. I had documentation of assault, I had proof of embezzlement, I had access to building systems Hugo didn't know I could see. But I couldn't go to the police with half a story. 40 years as an auditor had taught me that incomplete evidence gets dismissed. I needed everything, every transaction, every forged signature, every dollar stolen. I leaned back in my chair staring at the Delaware registration form spread across my desk. Saskia's family connection meant this wasn't Hugo acting alone in desperation. This was a coordinated multi-year conspiracy to drain my grandfather's legacy dry. I picked up my phone. I had exactly one person I could trust with what I'd just found. I stared at the phone in my hand, the Delaware Shell Company documents spread across my desk like evidence exhibits waiting for a courtroom. Hugo and Saskia had been systematically looting my grandfather's trust for years, and I had the proof. But proof meant nothing without someone who could help me present it properly. There was exactly one person in Chicago I trusted with what I'd just discovered, and I'd known him for 40 years. I called my attorney Lyle Wolfe, 62, at exactly 7:30 a.m., the only person outside my granddaughter I'd trusted for the past 40 years, ever since we met in graduate school when he was studying law and I was studying forensic accounting. He answered on the second ring. "Vernon, it's Sunday morning. This better be important. Hugo attacked Cleo, used construction pliers on her wrist to sabotage her scholarship, recorded me destroying his Porsche when I confronted him, and I just spent the night documenting that he and Saskia have been embezzling from the family trust through Delaware shell companies for the past 5 years. Silence on the line for 3 seconds. "I'm making coffee," Lyle said. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." I spent the next hour walking him through everything. The pink gloves, the pliers marks, the Global Fund scholarship, Hugo's call to the fund 3 days before the attack, the hospital visit and Dr. Ross's report, the security cameras recording my rage, the building management master account that was still active, the 3 Delaware companies, Saskia's family connection, the forged land transfer documents. Lyle didn't interrupt. He never did when I was presenting findings. That was one of the things I'd always appreciated about him. He knew how to listen to an audit. When I finished, I heard him take a long breath. "Vernon, this isn't just family fraud. This is federal wire fraud, interstate embezzlement, and forged documents on property transfers. We're talking 10-year minimum sentences if this goes to prosecution." "Good." "No, not good. Listen to me carefully. Hugo will come after anyone helping you. That includes me. He'll file ethics complaints, try to get me disbarred. The video of you smashing his car gives him ammunition. He'll claim I'm representing someone with violent tendencies, that I'm enabling you to harass him. The Illinois bar takes those accusations seriously, even when they're false. Then we find another attorney. I won't let you risk—" "Stop!" Lyle's voice cut through my objection with the same firmness he used in courtrooms. "I've been your attorney for 40 years. You think I'm walking away now because Hugo might file a complaint? Lyle, here's what's going to happen. Hugo is going to attack you. He's going to use that video. He's probably already planning to file for emergency custody of Cleo, claiming you're dangerous and unstable. When that happens, he'll target everyone in your corner. Your friends, your advisors, me." I gripped the phone tighter. "So what do you propose?" "I propose we use that against him." I waited. "Hugo will file an ethics complaint against me," Lyle said, "probably within the next few days. He'll claim I'm helping you harass him, that I'm facilitating illegal retaliation. The bar will open an investigation, standard procedure." "Which hurts your practice." which gets me temporarily suspended while they investigate. Lyle's voice carried something I hadn't heard before, a strategic edge I recognized from my own planning. A temporarily suspended lawyer, Hugo, will think I'm neutralized. He'll think he won. He'll stop watching me. And that's when I can work freely without anyone monitoring my movements or my communications. 40 years. We'd met in law school when I was studying accounting. He'd been the one to recommend me for my first audit position. We'd worked dozens of cases together over the decades, corporate fraud investigations, where I'd provide the financial analysis and he'd handle the legal strategy. You're talking about accepting false accusations, I said. I'm talking about accepting temporary suspension as a strategic move. 6 weeks, maybe 8. The bar investigation will clear me eventually. Hugo has no real evidence, just accusations. But in those 6 weeks, I can build a federal case without Hugo knowing I'm still involved. I can coordinate with prosecutors. I can compile your evidence into something that will hold up in court. I can't ask you to sacrifice 40 years of reputation. You're not asking. I'm offering. And Vernon, listen to me. You need someone they're not watching. You're going to be fighting custody battles, CPS investigations, possible civil suits. Hugo will monitor every attorney you contact. But a temporarily suspended lawyer, someone he thinks he already defeated, Hugo will get careless. That's when we move. Lyle, this could destroy your practice. Your granddaughter had pliers clamped on her wrists by a man who's been stealing your family's legacy for 5 years. You really think I'm going to sit this out because of my bar standing? The phone line carried only the sound of his breathing and mine. I need you to do something, Lyle said. Don't contact me directly after today. Don't email. Don't call my office. Hugo will be monitoring everything. Set up an encrypted message account. I'll send you the details. When you need me, use that. And Vernon, document everything. Every conversation with CPS, every interaction with Hugo, every dollar you can trace. Build the evidence file like you're conducting the audit of your life. Because I am. Yes, you are. He paused. I'm going to make some calls. Federal prosecutors I trust. People who specialize in interstate fraud. Get them ready. When the time comes, we'll need to move fast. Lyle. The phone went silent before I could respond. Lyle had hung up, and I knew him well enough to know he'd already started making calls. I looked down at my hands, fingers that had signed thousands of audit reports over 40 years. This time, they wouldn't sign anything. They'd dismantle. I had 6 hours between Lyle's call and what came next. 6 hours to organize my evidence files, photograph the trust documents, and prepare for Hugo's inevitable counterattack. I knew my son well enough to predict his next move. The knock on my door came at exactly 2 p.m. Sunday afternoon, 6 hours after I'd hung up with Lyle. Officer Diane Caldwell from Child Protective Services, mid-40s, with tired eyes that suggested she'd investigated too many family betrayals, stood at my door holding a leather case file and a police escort. Mr. Mercer, I'm Officer Caldwell, Child Protective Services. We received an emergency report this morning regarding your granddaughter, Cleo. May I come in? Bow. I stepped aside. Of course. The police officer stayed by the door while Officer Caldwell followed me into the foyer. She opened her case file and pulled out a tablet. Mr. Mercer, we received an emergency report alleging you deliberately harmed your granddaughter to extort funds from your son. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I'm sorry, what? The complaint states that you injured Cleo's wrist with construction pliers and are using the injury to demand money from Hugo Mercer, your son. The complainant claims you have a history of financial instability and are leveraging the child for extortion. May I see the complaint? She hesitated, then turned the tablet toward me. Anonymous filing submitted at 6:47 a.m. Sunday morning, 2 hours before I'd even called Lyle. The complaint described how I'd deliberately used pliers on Cleo's wrist to create injury evidence I could use for blackmail. How I'd threatened Hugo with false abuse accusations unless he paid me. How I was mentally unstable and dangerous to the child. And attached to the digital filing was video footage. Me swinging a golf club into Hugo's Porsche. Again and again. Shattered glass. Crumpled metal. Rage captured in high definition from 3 different security camera angles. This security video was submitted as evidence of unstable, violent behavior, Officer Caldwell said. The complainant states you're using the child as leverage for financial gain. I looked at the timestamp on the complaint. Filed this morning, but the complaint described events that allegedly happened yesterday after Hugo injured Cleo, but before I'd destroyed his car. The narrative was perfectly constructed. I was the aggressor. Hugo was the victim. Cleo was a pawn I'd injured myself to use as a weapon. Who filed this complaint? I asked. It's anonymous, but the video evidence comes from Hugo Mercer's residential security system. And there's a supporting statement from someone identifying themselves as a concerned family member. Saskia. It had to be Saskia. She'd filed anonymously while Hugo provided the video evidence that made me look violent and unstable. They'd reversed the entire story in less than 12 hours. Mr. Mercer, I need to conduct a full interview. Where is Cleo now? Sit down. Upstairs, sleeping. I'll need to speak with her separately, but first I have questions for you. Officer Caldwell led me into my own living room and sat across from me with her tablet balanced on her knee. The police officer remained in the foyer, a reminder that this wasn't a friendly conversation. 40 years of honest work, thousands of audits, never once questioned. And now, I stood accused of using pliers on my own granddaughter. Mr. Mercer, the complaint alleges you're in financial distress. Can you describe your current financial situation? My current liquid assets total $847,392 as of Friday's close. My tax returns for 40 years are filed with the IRS, 0 audit flags. I don't need to extort anyone. She made notes on her tablet. Employment status. Retired. I spent 40 years as a senior forensic auditor for corporate investigations. My retirement is independently funded. No debt. Mortgage paid off in 2018. The complaint states you've been requesting money from your son. I haven't spoken to Hugo about money in over 2 years. He manages the Vance Family Trust. I'm a beneficiary, but I've never drawn on those funds. Can you explain the video footage of you destroying your son's vehicle? Here it was. The question I'd been preparing for since I'd dropped that golf club in Hugo's driveway. I can explain it, I said, but first, may I show you something? I walked to my desk and retrieved Dr. Ross's medical report. Last night, I took Cleo to Chicago Memorial Hospital Pediatric Emergency Room. Dr. Celeste Ross examined her wrist and documented the injuries. The injury assessment is on page 2. Officer Caldwell took the report, her expression neutral. You have documentation of your granddaughter's injury. Yes, because my son Hugo injured her with industrial pliers from his construction site on Saturday afternoon. When I discovered what he'd done, I reacted with anger instead of proper procedure. I destroyed his car. It was a mistake driven by rage at seeing my granddaughter hurt. But I didn't injure her. He did. She turned to the second page, reading silently. I watched her eyes move across Dr. Ross's clinical description, the marks, the pattern, the measurements. And then she reached the critical paragraph. Officer Caldwell turned to the next page. She paused, reading the line again. Injury consistent with industrial metal pliers, she read aloud slowly. Her eyes lifted from the page to meet mine. I said nothing. Let the contradiction speak for itself. The anonymous complaint claimed I injured Cleo with pliers to extort Hugo. But the medical report documented that the pliers used were industrial construction pliers, the kind found on Hugo's tower construction site, not in a residential home. If I'd injured Cleo myself for extortion, I would have used household tools. Industrial construction pliers pointed directly at someone with access to a construction site, someone like Hugo. Officer Caldwell set the medical report on the coffee table between us, her tired eyes studying my face. Mr. Mercer, she said carefully, I'm going to need to speak with Cleo now. Officer Caldwell spent 20 minutes interviewing Cleo privately upstairs. When she came back down, she told me the investigation would continue for 72 hours, and I should expect a follow-up visit. She didn't say what Cleo had told her, but the suspicion in her eyes had shifted to something else. Not trust exactly, but doubt about the anonymous complaint. As soon as Officer Caldwell's car pulled away from my house at 3:30, I went back to my study to finish what I'd started. The medical report had created enough contradiction to slow Hugo's attack, but it wouldn't stop him. I needed to understand the full scope of his desperation, which meant understanding the financial pressure driving every move he made. I opened my laptop and accessed the Chicago Public Real Estate Database. Commercial property records were public information, and so were major construction loans filed with the county clerk. I searched for Vance Luxury Tower. The property listing appeared immediately. $18 million project value announced at groundbreaking 2 years ago. Hugo standing in front of architectural renderings wearing a hard hat and smiling for cameras. The press release described him as a visionary developer bringing luxury residential living to Chicago's riverfront. I clicked through to the financing records. First Chicago Bank construction loan, $18 million. Filed March 2023. That matched the announced value, but there was more. Midwest Capital Partners secured commercial loan, $14 million. Filed September 2023. Prairie Trust and Lending Project expansion loan, $9,200,000. Filed February 2024. I added the numbers twice to make sure. $41 million in outstanding loans against a project with a publicly announced value of $18 million. Hugo was underwater by over 100%. The tower wasn't just behind schedule or over budget. It was a financial disaster that would collapse the moment the banks called their notes. I'd audited hundreds of failing companies over 4 decades. They all looked the same from the outside: confident press releases, glossy photos, executive smiles, right up until the collapse. I pulled up Hugo's recent media appearances. 3 interviews in the past month, each one talking about the tower's success, the innovative design, the international investors, the premier residential experience. All lies built on $41 million of debt he couldn't repay. I searched for recent project updates and found a promotional website for the tower inauguration. Saturday, June 14th, 8 p.m. Grand opening ceremony with city officials, investors, and media. The centerpiece of the event, Hugo signing the international investment contract that would bring in funding for the tower's completion. I leaned back in my chair, the pieces falling into place. Hugo needed that international contract, needed the investment money to cover the bank loans before they came due, needed to maintain the illusion of success long enough to escape the fraud he'd been running for 3 years. And then Cleo won the scholarship. The timing couldn't have been worse for Hugo. His son Tristan disqualified for plagiarism. The orphan granddaughter winning legitimately. The media attention that would come with a 10-year-old architecture prodigy from the Vance family, but not from Hugo's branch, not from the successful developer's family, from the dismissed elder grandfather's family. Hugo couldn't afford that comparison. Couldn't afford anyone looking too closely at family finances while he was trying to close the biggest deal of his life. Couldn't afford the banks or investors asking questions about why one part of the family was thriving while he was secretly drowning in debt. So he'd attacked Cleo's hands, tried to sabotage the scholarship, and when I'd reacted with rage, he'd used it to flip the entire narrative, making himself the victim and me the aggressor, all to buy himself enough time to reach Saturday. I checked the construction permits filed with the city. The tower was scheduled for occupancy inspection on June 20th, 6 days after the inauguration. But I knew enough about construction timelines to recognize the pattern. If Hugo didn't sign that international contract on Saturday, if the money didn't come through, the inspection would fail and the banks would call their loans. The entire empire would collapse. I pulled up a calendar on my screen. Sunday, June 8th, Saturday, June 14th. 5 full days. 6, if you counted Saturday itself, but the contract signing was scheduled for 8 p.m. By then, it would be too late to stop anything. The money would be in motion. The fraud would be buried under legitimate investment documentation. I opened a new document and started building a timeline. Sunday, CPS investigation active under scrutiny. Monday, coordinate with FBI 4 days until contract. Tuesday, 3 days until Hugo's deadline. Wednesday, 2 days until contract signing. Thursday, Cleo's scholarship interview, 1 day until Hugo escapes. Friday, last day before Saturday deadline. Saturday, 8 p.m., international contract signing. Hugo's escape or capture. $41 million in debt, and Hugo had exactly 5 days to sign that international contract before the banks called the loans. That's why he attacked Cleo when he did. That's why he'd moved so fast to reverse the narrative with the anonymous complaint. That's why Saskia had filed at 6:47 a.m. Sunday morning, barely 12 hours after I'd destroyed the Porsche. They were running out of time, which meant Hugo would get more desperate, more dangerous. He'd already attacked a child and framed me for it. What would he do with 4 days left, 3 days too? I picked up my phone and opened the encrypted messaging app Lyle had sent me instructions for setting up. One message waited. FBI contact made. Monday 9 a.m. Federal Plaza. Come alone, bring everything. Lyle had moved fast. 1 day to get federal attention on a case this size was remarkable. But the timing made sense. If Hugo was signing international contracts that crossed into federal wire fraud jurisdiction, interstate bank loans, forged property documents across state lines, Delaware shell companies, this wasn't just family drama anymore. This was federal. I looked at my study wall at the documents spread across my desk. Medical reports, trust files, Delaware company registrations, building management login credentials, bank records showing the debt. I had 5 days to dismantle what Hugo had spent 3 years building. 5 days to protect Cleo. 5 days to stop a man who would use pliers on a child's wrist to cover his fraud. The calendar glowed on my screen, Sunday to Saturday, 120 hours. The countdown had started. I stared at the 5-day timeline on my screen, each day representing another layer of risk. Hugo would attack again. Lucille would pressure me. CPS would investigate. And I had to endure all of it without revealing that every hour brought Hugo closer to federal prison instead of closer to escape. The call from Aunt Lucille came exactly 90 minutes after I'd discovered Hugo's Saturday deadline. My Aunt Lucille Hampton, 75, and the self-appointed matriarch of the Mercer clan, called with that familiar imperious tone she'd used to command 3 generations of family decisions. "Vernon, this family embarrassment ends now. No greeting, no inquiry about Cleo, just the voice of someone who'd decided the outcome before dialing the number. Lucille, you will apologize to Hugo, sign those land transfer documents, and withdraw these ridiculous accusations. Tomorrow morning, I've already spoken with the family attorney. The land transfer documents, the ones I'd found with forged signatures transferring my grandfather's property into Hugo's name. Lucille knew about them. She wasn't calling to mediate a family dispute. She was calling to enforce the theft. And in exchange, Hugo withdraws the domestic violence complaint he filed with CPS. Exactly. This is the only way to fix what you've broken. Hugo is willing to be generous despite your violent behavior. The video evidence is quite damning, Vernon. I see. Do you... Her voice hardened. Because if you refuse, I will personally ensure every member of this family knows what you've done. Your name will be struck from every family record. You'll be completely alone. No support, no legacy, nothing. I'd known Lucille my entire life. She taught me to ride a bicycle when I was 6. Now she was demanding I hand my grandfather's land to the son who'd attacked my granddaughter. I'll need to think about it, I said. There's nothing to think about. You have until Wednesday morning. Sign the documents or face complete isolation. And Vernon. That includes Cleo. The family will petition for guardianship. Do you really want to fight the entire Mercer clan in court? She hung up before I could respond. I sat in my study holding the phone, processing what had just happened. Lucille knew about the land transfers. She was actively pressuring me to sign them, which meant this wasn't just Hugo and Saskia running the fraud. The clan matriarch was complicit. How many other family members knew? How deep did the conspiracy go? I opened my encrypted message app and typed a message to Lyle. Lucille called, demanding land signature by Wednesday, threatened guardianship petition for Cleo. His response came 30 seconds later. Expected. Don't sign anything. FBI tomorrow 9 a.m. confirmed. Monday morning at 9 o'clock, I walked into the FBI Chicago field office in the West Loop. I'd left Cleo with a neighbor telling her I had business meetings. The truth would have terrified her. Agent Grant Harrison, 50, from the FBI's Economic Crime Division sat across from me in a sparse federal office reviewing my preliminary files with the weary expression of someone who'd investigated too many family betrayals. Mr. Mercer, this evidence shows clear embezzlement. He tapped the Delaware Shell Company documents. 3 companies registered agent connected to your daughter-in-law's family business. Management fees, siphoning trust funds. This is prosecutable right now. But, I asked, but if we move now, your son gets 3 to 5 years maximum. Embezzlement charges, maybe some forgery for the land transfers. He'd be out in 2 years with good behavior. I leaned forward. And if we wait until Saturday? Agent Harrison pulled up a document on his computer screen and turned it toward me. Federal wire fraud statute, international contract provisions, interstate banking violations, wire fraud across international borders, using fraudulently obtained funds to enter contracts with foreign investors. That's mandatory minimum 10 years federal prison, no parole. Add the construction fraud, we'd need time to fully document, and we're looking at 15 to 20 years. So we wait. So you endure whatever he throws at you for the next 5 days. The CPS investigation, the family pressure, possible civil suits, and you can't defend yourself publicly because any premature revelation warns him off the Saturday signing. Agent Harrison's eyes held mine. Can you do that? I thought about Cleo's wrists. The pliers marks, the missing bracelet, the pink gloves forced on a 10-year-old child to hide the evidence of torture. Yes, I said, I can do that. We'll coordinate quietly. I'll contact the Department of Buildings about the construction permits, get someone looking at material sourcing. If there's fraud in the tower itself, we want that documented before Saturday. But Mr. Mercer, you're essentially bait. Hugo will escalate when you don't respond the way he expects. It could get dangerous. I understand. Agent Harrison closed the case file. Your attorney, Lyle Wolfe, is smart. The voluntary suspension strategy is clever, makes Hugo think he won while Lyle works in the background. We'll use the same approach. No visible FBI presence, no obvious investigation, just quiet evidence gathering while Hugo thinks he's 5 days from escape. I stood up to leave. What happens Saturday night after he signs? 8:15 p.m. federal agents enter the venue and execute arrest warrants. Hugo, his wife if she's present, and any co-conspirators we can definitively link to the fraud. Everything he's built collapses in front of the investors, the media, and the city officials he invited to witness his triumph. The poetic justice wasn't lost on me. Hugo had attacked Cleo during what he called a career day celebration. He'd framed me during what should have been a family conversation. Now he'd be arrested during his own inauguration ceremony. Agent Harrison looked at me across the desk, his expression grave. Mr. Mercer, if you want your son to receive the full punishment he deserves for everything he's done, don't rush this. Let him finish his crime in front of the world. I nodded slowly. 5 more days of enduring his attacks while the trap set itself. 5 more days of Lucille's threats, CPS investigations, family pressure. 5 more days of being the dismissed elder while Hugo celebrated his impending triumph. And Hugo had no idea the clock was ticking against him, not me. I left the FBI office knowing Agent Harrison was right. I had to endure 5 more days as bait while Hugo walked confidently toward his own arrest. But enduring meant understanding every crime Hugo had committed, because the more I knew, the stronger the federal case became. The pliers, I kept coming back to that detail. Industrial construction pliers from the Vance luxury tower site. Not household tools, not something from a workshop. Specific heavy-duty industrial pliers that Hugo would only have access to at his construction project. Which meant I needed to understand that project better. Monday afternoon at 2 o'clock, I opened my laptop and accessed the Chicago Department of Buildings public permit database. Every construction project in the city filed material specifications, supplier contracts, and safety inspection schedules. It was all public record if you knew where to look. I pulled up the Vance luxury tower permits and began reading. The structural engineering specifications called for grade 350 steel throughout the building's frame, standard requirement for residential towers over 15 stories. The specifications were dated and approved by city engineers 2 years ago. I searched for the material supplier contracts. 3 suppliers listed, 2 domestic manufacturers providing concrete and finishing materials, 1 international import company handling structural steel, Pacific Rim Industrial exports registered in Hong Kong. I'd never heard of them. I opened a new browser window and searched for Pacific Rim Industrial exports in construction industry databases. Nothing. No major projects, no industry certifications, no safety compliance records. I tried searching international import manifests filed with U.S. Customs. There. Shipping container manifest dated 14 months ago. Pacific Rim Industrial exports shipping. Structural steel to Vance luxury tower construction site, Chicago. Declared steel grade 250. Not 350. Grade 250 steel. Minimum tensile strength 30% lower than the building specifications required. Substandard material that would pass visual inspection but couldn't safely support the loads the building was designed to carry. I sat back in my chair feeling sick. Hugo wasn't just embezzling money. He was building a tower with steel that couldn't hold the weight it was supposed to carry. Thousands of families would move into those apartments. Thousands of children would sleep in beds under ceilings held up by steel that didn't meet safety codes. I checked the construction budget documents I'd found in the family trust files. Materials, budget $12 million allocated for structural steel and concrete. I cross-referenced that against the import manifest pricing. Actual steel cost from Pacific Rim Industrial $7 million. $5 million difference disappeared. Hugo had imported cheap, substandard steel, pocketed the $5 million difference, and left a structurally compromised building in the middle of Chicago. This wasn't about my family's money anymore. This was about thousands of families who'd signed leases trusting the building above their children's beds wouldn't collapse. I opened my encrypted message app and sent a message to Agent Harrison. Found construction fraud. Smuggled grade 250 steel instead of required grade 350. $5 million embezzled from materials budget. Building structurally unsound. Need DOB inspector to verify before Saturday. His response came 3 minutes later. Will coordinate. Send full documentation. I spent the next 3 hours compiling everything. Import manifests, material specifications, budget discrepancies, customs declarations. By 5:45 Monday evening, I had a complete file showing Hugo had built a death trap and called it luxury housing. I sent it all to Agent Harrison, then sat staring at my screen, wondering how my son had become the kind of man who would endanger thousands of lives for money. The next morning at 8:15, my phone rang with a notification from the Illinois Bar Association. I opened the email with growing dread. Subject notice of disciplinary action. Attorney Lyle Wolfe. The email described 3 separate ethics complaints filed against Lyle by Hugo Mercer, alleging that Lyle had fabricated accusations, engaged in witness tampering, and violated professional conduct standards by assisting me in harassing Hugo. The Bar Association had opened a formal investigation and temporarily suspended Lyle's law license pending resolution. My phone rang before I could finish reading. Lyle. The Bar Association just suspended my license, he said calmly. Hugo filed 3 separate complaints yesterday. Lyle, this has gone too far. We need to... This is the plan, Vernon. His voice carried absolute certainty. Now I'm free to do what needs to be done. Trust me. But... The phone went silent. Lyle had hung up, and I knew him well enough to know he wouldn't answer if I called back. My only ally had just disappeared from the battlefield. I looked at my hands. The same hands that had discovered Hugo was building a tower that could kill people. The same hands that had signed audit reports for 40 years, always believing the truth mattered more than anything. And I had 4 days left to stop it. 4 days until Hugo signed the international contract and the FBI arrested him. 4 days until the tower's inauguration. 4 days until everyone knew what Hugo had done. But what if 4 days was too long? What if the building failed before Saturday? What if people moved in before anyone could inspect the steel? I picked up my phone and typed another message to Agent Harrison. How fast can DOB get an inspector to the tower site? His response, working on it. Inspector Neil Fletcher assigned. Should have preliminary assessment by Wednesday. Wednesday, 2 days from now, 3 days before Hugo's arrest. I set down my phone and stared at the evidence files spread across my desk. Cleo's medical report. Delaware shell companies, forged land transfers, smuggled steel, $5 million in construction fraud. And somewhere in Chicago, Hugo was celebrating what he thought was his impending victory, completely unaware that every piece of evidence I gathered was another year added to his federal sentence. The hunter who thought he was hunting didn't know he'd become the prey. Lyle was gone. My lawyer, suspended my only ally, disappeared into strategic silence. I had 4 days left and no one to trust except myself. But 40 years as an auditor had taught me something Hugo never learned. The most dangerous opponent is the one who works alone in the dark. My phone started buzzing at 3 p.m. Tuesday afternoon with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. I opened the first one. A former colleague from my auditing days. Vernon, I just saw the video. Are you okay? Do you need help? What video? I opened my laptop and searched for Hugo's name on social media. His account appeared immediately. 500,000 followers, real estate developer, community leader, family man. And at the top of his feed posted 20 minutes ago a video. I clicked play. Hugo sat in his office, expression grave and concerned. Behind him, architectural models of the tower gleamed under professional lighting. I'm sharing this with a heavy heart, Hugo said to the camera. My father has become dangerously unstable. He's making wild accusations about our family business, threatening violence, and I'm genuinely concerned for his mental health and the safety of my young niece in his care. The video cut to security footage. Me swinging a golf club into the Porsche, glass shattering, metal crumpling, 3 different camera angles showing every violent impact. This is my father destroying my car 2 nights ago, Hugo's voice narrated over the footage. Because I refused to give him money. I'm sharing this security footage so our community understands the threat he poses to himself and others. The video ended with Hugo's somber face. If you know Vernon Mercer, please reach out. He needs professional help, not enablement. My family is cooperating with authorities to ensure everyone's safety, especially his granddaughter Cleo. The view count was already at 47,000. My phone continued buzzing, more messages. Some are concerned, some were shocked, some carefully distancing themselves from what they'd just watched. Hugo had mobilized public opinion against me with surgical precision. I read every message with methodical calm, then opened my laptop and navigated to the offshore banking records I'd found buried in Lucille's trust files. Cayman Islands account. Deposits dating back 12 years, totaling over $3 million in unexplained funds. I took a screenshot of the account summary page showing Lucille's name, the $3 million balance, and the Cayman Bank logo. Then I opened my messaging app and sent it directly to Hugo with one line, "Does Aunt Lucille know you're mobilizing the family? Maybe we should ask her about this." I watched the screen. Message delivered. Message read. 12 minutes of silence. Then Lucille's phone number disappeared from my contact list. Blocked. No calls, no messages. Just absolute silence from the woman who'd threatened to exile me from the family 3 days ago. Hugo thought isolation would break me. He didn't understand that 40 years as an auditor meant I was used to working alone in the dark, finding what people buried. At 6 p.m. Tuesday evening, I called the Chicago Department of Buildings and asked for the Structural Safety Division. Inspector Neil Fletcher, 48, from the Chicago Department of Buildings Safety Division, listened to my preliminary evidence about the tower's smuggled steel with the growing alarm of someone who understood exactly what structural failure meant. Mr. Mercer, if what you're saying is true, we're talking about thousands of residents in a structurally compromised building. Grade 250 steel where grade 350 is required. His voice carried controlled urgency. I need irrefutable evidence, import manifests, material specifications. Everything is documented. You'll have it by morning, I said. Everything official. How soon can you send it? Tonight. I'm compiling the full file now. Mr. Mercer, this is serious. If you're wrong, you're accusing a major developer of criminal negligence. If you're right, he paused. We'll need to coordinate with federal authorities. This crosses multiple jurisdictions. FBI agent Grant Harrison is already coordinating. I'll copy you on the complete dossier. I hung up and began the final compilation. 40 years of auditing had taught me how to build an unbreakable case. Every claim documented, every number is sourced, every accusation backed by official records that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I worked through the entire night. Financial records showing the Delaware shell companies receiving trust funds, Dr. Ross's medical documentation of Cleo's injuries, the analysis of Saskia's family connection to the registered agents, construction material import manifests showing Pacific Rim Industrial Shipping Grade 250 steel instead of the required grade 350. Customs declarations, budget discrepancies proving $5 million embezzled from materials costs. Offshore banking records routing money through the Cayman accounts. 200 gigabytes of evidence compiled into a single encrypted package. At exactly 2 a.m. Wednesday morning, I sent it through official federal channels to both FBI Agent Harrison and DOB Inspector Fletcher. The confirmation screen appeared. Package delivered. Received. Logged into a federal investigation database with case number and timestamp. I looked at the confirmation screen. The dossier had been delivered to both Agent Harrison and Inspector Fletcher through official federal channels. 200 gigabytes of evidence. Every crime is documented, every dollar traced, every forged signature highlighted. I shut down the computer and looked out at the dark Chicago street. Wednesday morning, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. 3 days left until Saturday. 3 days until Hugo signed the international contract in front of investors, media, and city officials. 3 days until federal agents walked into his triumph and arrested him for everything he'd done. But first I had to make Hugo think he'd already won. I had to convince him that the public video Lyle's suspension and Lucille's pressure had broken me. Had to get close enough to gather the final pieces of evidence the FBI would need. Now came the hardest part, making Hugo think he'd already won. The dossier was delivered. 200 gigabytes of evidence sitting in federal databases ready to detonate Saturday night. But first I had to get close enough to Hugo to gather the final pieces, which meant convincing everyone, Hugo, Lucille, the entire family, that I'd been broken. Wednesday morning I sat at the kitchen table with my phone rehearsing how a defeated man sounds when he begs. I practiced at dawn while Cleo slept upstairs. A trembling voice, pauses as if choking back emotion, the verbal equivalent of shoulders hunched in submission. I'd spent 40 years reading people's lies in boardrooms. Now I had to lie to myself. At 7:30 a.m. I called Lucille. She answered on the first ring. Vernon. Her voice carried that careful neutrality people use when they're waiting to see which version of you shows up. Lucille. I let my voice crack slightly. I need to talk to you about Hugo. Silence. I could hear her calculating. I was wrong, I said, letting the words shake. About everything, the accusations, the video he posted, I saw it, I saw myself, I paused, injecting shame into the silence. I look like a violent old man who's lost his mind. Vernon, please, just listen. I made my hand tremble against the phone, letting the movement affect my voice. Not much, just enough. I want to apologize to Hugo, in person. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you to arrange it. Thursday night. I'll come wherever he wants. I'll sign whatever documents he needs. I can't keep fighting my own son. The satisfaction in her voice was audible. She'd been waiting for this, waiting for me to collapse under the weight of Hugo's attacks. I'm glad you've finally seen the reason, Vernon. This family embarrassment has gone on long enough. I know, I'm sorry. Can you arrange it Thursday night? I'll speak with Hugo today. I'm sure he'll be willing to accept your apology given how comprehensive you're willing to be. She paused. And the land documents, you'll sign them. The forged land transfers, the theft Hugo had been orchestrating for 3 years. Yes, I said, making my voice small, whatever he needs. Good, I'll call you this afternoon with details. And Vernon, this is your only chance. If you cause another scene, there won't be a third opportunity. I understand, thank you, Lucille. She hung up and I set the phone down on the kitchen table. My hand was still shaking, but I was making it shake. I'd controlled the tremor throughout the entire call, adding it to my voice like an actor adding stage makeup. Every pause calculated, every crack in my voice deliberate. And Lucille had believed every second of it. I spent Wednesday afternoon preparing the tools I'd need for Thursday night's performance. The portable data extraction device looked like a phone charger, small, innocuous, something you'd plug in and forget about. Agent Harrison had provided it through encrypted channels. Plug it into any USB port and it would quietly copy every file it could access. I tested it on my own computer to make sure I understood how it worked. 30 seconds to initialize. 4 minutes to complete a full extraction if the target drive had standard business files. 4 minutes I'd have to create during dinner conversation without Hugo noticing. Next, I practiced the master key credentials. The building management system I'd installed 10 years ago still used my administrator account. Agent Harrison had confirmed the login was still active and provided updated access codes. I typed them from memory vmercer_admin, the new password he'd given me, the two-factor authentication bypass code. If I could get to a computer in Hugo's office, I could access the entire building's digital infrastructure during those 4 critical minutes. Cleo came downstairs around 4 p.m. and found me at the kitchen table with my old laptop and the data extraction device. "What's that?" she asked. "Technology for tomorrow night. Are you going to see Uncle Hugo?" I nodded. I have to pretend to apologize to him, pretend I was wrong about everything. She looked at me with those 2 old eyes that had seen her hands clamped with pliers. "Why do you have to pretend to be weak when you're the strongest person I know?" I had no answer for that. Nothing that would make sense to a 10-year-old. Nothing that would explain why strength sometimes looks like surrender. "Because sometimes," I said finally, "you have to let bad people think they won before you can stop them." She nodded slowly, like she understood more than she should have to. That night, I went to my closet and found the old charcoal suit I'd worn to auditing conferences 15 years ago. Before I retired, before my wife died, before Cleo came to live with me. The suit was outdated, slightly too large now. One button hung loose on a thread I'd never bothered to repair. Perfect. I tried it on Wednesday night and looked at myself in the bedroom mirror. The suit hung on my frame like defeat. The loose button, the outdated cut, the shoulders that seemed to sag even when I stood straight. This was the costume I needed. Not armor, not confidence, just an old man in an old suit beaten down by circumstances he couldn't control. I wanted Hugo to look at me Thursday night and see exactly that, a dismissed elder who'd finally accepted his place. A grandfather who'd been broken by his son's superior strategy. I wanted Hugo to pity me. Just one more night. Tomorrow he'd see a broken old man begging for forgiveness, signing documents, accepting defeat. By Saturday he'd see the inside of a federal cell. But first he needed to believe he'd won. Thursday evening arrived. I put on the shabby charcoal suit and checked the data extraction device in my pocket one last time. Tonight, Hugo would see exactly what he expected, a broken old man accepting humiliation. Tomorrow night, the FBI would see every file Hugo thought was hidden. The charcoal suit felt looser than I remembered when I walked into Hugo's office Thursday night. His corporate office occupied the top floor of a downtown building, all glass and steel and expensive furniture designed to impress clients. Hugo sat at the head of a conference table, Saskia on his right, Lucille on his left. 3 chairs facing one. A tribunal designed to reinforce hierarchy. I walked in with my shoulders hunched, eyes down, every movement projecting defeat. "Dad," Hugo gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." I sat. "Lucille tells me you wanted to apologize." "Yes." I let my voice shake slightly. "I was wrong. About everything. The accusations. I paused as if the word hurt to say. "The video you posted. I saw myself. I looked like a man who'd lost his mind." Hugo leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at his lips. "You destroyed my car with a golf club, Dad, in front of security cameras. What would you call that?" "A mistake. A terrible mistake driven by—" I swallowed hard, performing shame. "By jealousy, I think. You've built so much. The tower, your reputation. And I'm just a retired auditor living in the same house I've had for 30 years. Saskia exchanged a glance with Lucille. They were enjoying this. "I'm glad you finally see it," Hugo said. "This family can't function with you making wild accusations and threatening legal action. We need to move forward, together. I understand. I'll sign whatever documents you need, the land transfers, whatever makes this right." Hugo nodded slowly. "Good, that's a start. But Dad, I've been thinking about your situation. You're 60, retired, living alone with Cleo. That can't be good for either of you." Here it came, whatever humiliation he'd been planning. "I've talked to Saskia and Lucille. We think it would be good for you to have structure, purpose." He smiled that same smile I'd seen when he hurt Cleo's wrists. "I suppose we could find you something. Receptionist work, minimum wage, so you have something to do. Answer phones, greet clients, simple tasks you couldn't mess up." The room went quiet. Lucille and Saskia watched me, waiting for my reaction. Minimum wage receptionist work. At my son's company. Answering his phones, greeting his clients. Visible proof that he'd broken me, that I'd accepted my place beneath him. I let my voice crack with fake gratitude. "That's generous of you, son. Lucille nodded approvingly. See, family takes care of family when you behave. How long can a man kneel before his son pretends to notice? Before I tell you what. I did next comment A or B and tell me why in 5 to 10 words. A equals I'd have walked out or B equals do whatever it takes. Quick note, some details ahead are recreated for narrative impact. The lesson is what matters. Now, Hugo said, pulling a folder from his briefcase, let's discuss those land transfer documents. I reached for my water glass to buy time, deliberately misjudging the distance. The glass tipped water flooding across the table toward Hugo's papers. Oh God, I'm sorry. I jumped up grabbing napkins. I'm so clumsy. Careful. Hugo pulled his papers back. Just get the water before it reaches the equipment down there. Of course, of course. I knelt down beside his desk, mopping water from the carpet. And while I was there, hidden beneath the desk's shadow, I pulled the data extraction device from my pocket. It looked exactly like a phone charger. Small, black, innocuous. I plugged it into the USB port on the side of Hugo's server case and heard the quiet beep of initialization. 30 seconds. The device needed 30 seconds to establish connection, then 4 minutes to complete extraction. I'm so sorry, I said from beneath the desk, still dabbing at imaginary water spots. So clumsy. I'll have it cleaned up in just a moment. Vernon, it's fine. Just don't touch the equipment. Of course not. I'm being careful. I stood up slowly, performing the movements of an old man with bad knees. There. I think I got it all. I sat back down in my chair, the device now hidden beneath Hugo's desk, pulling every file he thought was safe. 4 minutes. I had to keep him talking for exactly 4 minutes without arousing suspicion. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. I smiled and nodded at Hugo's explanation of the tower's lobby design. The inauguration is Saturday night, Hugo was saying. 8 p.m., city officials, international investors, media coverage. It's going to be the defining moment of my career. That's wonderful, I said. You've worked so hard. 3 minutes, 10 seconds. And after the contract signing, we'll have the funding to complete the residential floors. Pre-leasing starts Monday. He smiled. The first major development project I've completed entirely on my own. I'm proud of you, son. The words tasted like ash, but I made them sound genuine. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Saskia was explaining something about the inauguration guest list. I nodded at appropriate moments, my attention split between maintaining the defeated persona and tracking the invisible countdown in my head. 1 minute, 45 seconds. Hugo leaned forward, frowning slightly. You're sweating, Dad. Are you feeling all right? Hugo was staring at me, waiting for an answer about why I was sweating. The device beneath his desk had 90 seconds left to complete the extraction. 90 seconds I had to maintain the performance without arousing more suspicion. I told Hugo the office was warm and he believed me. Sorry, I said, wiping my forehead with a shaky hand. The office is warm, and I'm nervous about signing the documents. It feels so final. Hugo's frown softened into satisfaction. It is final, Dad. That's the point. You're accepting reality. Finally. 60 seconds left. I understand, I said. You're right about everything. Saskia exchanged a glance with Lucille. They could see my surrender, my defeat, my complete collapse under the weight of Hugo's superior strategy. 30 seconds. Good, Hugo said. Now let's make this official. The device clicked silently beneath the desk. Extraction complete. I had every file Hugo thought was secure. Hugo turned to his briefcase, pulling out the land transfer documents. While his back was turned, I slid my hand beneath the desk and disconnected the device, palming it into my jacket pocket in one smooth motion. Sign it tonight, Dad. No more delays. The documents spread across the table. Property transfers for the parcels my grandfather had bought in the 1960s. Prime Chicago real estate worth millions. All of it going into Hugo's name with my signature, except for the clause I'd added. Lyle had drafted it for me before his suspension, buried in the legal language on page 3, paragraph 7. This transfer shall become effective upon the complete withdrawal of all domestic violence complaints and custody proceedings filed by Hugo Mercer against Vernon Mercer. Hugo would never withdraw those complaints. They were his leverage, his proof that I was dangerous and unstable, which meant the contract would never be effective. My signature would be legally meaningless. But Hugo wouldn't discover that until he tried to file the transfers, and the court rejected them. Of course, you're right, I'll sign. I picked up the pen with trembling fingers, real trembling this time, not performance. The magnitude of what I was doing settled over me like weight. I paused, pen hovering over the signature line. Vernon, Lucille said sharply, don't make us regret giving you this chance. No, I'm sorry, I took a breath. It's my grandfather's land, the last piece of him. But you're right, family is more important than property. I signed. Vernon Mercer, dated, witnessed by Lucille and Saskia. Finally, Lucille said. Some sense from you. Hugo collected the documents, sliding them back into his briefcase with the careful movements of someone handling treasure. He thought he'd won, thought he'd broken me completely, thought I'd just signed away my grandfather's legacy out of fear and desperation. I stood up, shoulders still hunched. Thank you for giving me another chance. Don't waste it, Dad. Hugo walked me to the door. I'll be in touch about that receptionist position. Monday morning, probably. Be ready. I nodded and left, walking down the hallway to the elevator with slow, defeated steps. Just an old man in a shabby suit who'd finally accepted his place. I walked to my car with Hugo's victory still echoing behind me, and I felt nothing but cold mathematics. The drive home took 20 minutes. I spent them thinking about the data device in my pocket, about the trapped contract Hugo thought was his triumph, about Saturday night when everything he'd built would collapse. At home, Cleo was already asleep. I went to my study, locked the door, and plugged the data extraction device into my computer. 200 gigabytes. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen as files copied from the device to my encrypted hard drive. 11 p.m. became midnight. Midnight became 1 a.m. The files organized themselves into folders, financial records, emails, internal memos, construction contracts, and deep in the directory structure a folder marked Personal Audio. I opened it. 14 audio files, conversations recorded by Hugo's office security system, dates ranging back 6 months. I started with the most recent one, Thursday afternoon, 2 hours before I'd arrived for dinner. Hugo's voice came through my speakers crystal clear. The mental institution paperwork is ready for Monday. Saskia's response, good. After the deeds clear Friday, he won't have standing to contest anything. No property, no financial leverage, nothing. Exactly. We file Monday morning. Get him committed for psychiatric evaluation. The judge will see the pattern violent behavior, the Porsche incident making wild accusations about embezzlement, all documented. What about Cleo? Lucille's already prepared the guardianship petition. We'll argue Vernon is mentally unfit. She becomes a ward of the family, which means I get decision-making power over the trust since she's a minor. And Vernon? Hugo's voice carried that same satisfaction I'd heard in his office tonight. Dad won't even know what happened until he's medicated. By the time he's clear-headed enough to fight back, we'll control everything. The land, the trust, Cleo's inheritance, all of it. Mental institution, my son's voice said it twice. I sat in my study at 2:47 a.m. listening to my son and his wife calmly discuss having me declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized so they could steal everything while I was sedated. Not just the money, not just the land. They were planning to take Cleo. I paused the audio file at 2:47 a.m., Hugo's voice frozen mid-word institution. For the first time in 7 days, I felt complete peace. Not rage, not horror, just absolute certainty. Tomorrow I would make one phone call, and Saturday morning federal agents would hear every second of this recording. They'd hear Hugo planning to have his father committed to steal his granddaughter. They'd hear Saskia calculating the timeline. They'd hear Lucille's involvement in the guardianship scheme. And then they'd arrest all of them. I closed my laptop at 3 a.m. Friday morning with Hugo's voice still echoing in my mind. Mental institution. They'd planned to have me committed Monday, but they wouldn't get the chance. In less than 36 hours, federal agents would be executing arrest warrants instead. The FBI Chicago office was quieter than I expected when I walked in Friday at 9 a.m. Agent Harrison met me in the lobby, led me to a secure conference room, and closed the door. I set my encrypted hard drive on the table between us. Everything, I said. 200 gigabytes extracted from Hugo's office server last night. Financial records, emails, internal memos, and audio files recorded by his own security system. Harrison plugged the drive into his laptop and began reviewing files. I watched his expression change as he clicked through folders. Delaware shell companies, offshore account routing, forged land transfer signatures, construction material import manifests showing substandard steel. And then he opened the audio folder. Hugo's voice filled the conference room. The mental institution paperwork is ready for Monday. Harrison listened to the entire conversation without interruption. When it finished, he sat back in his chair. This is airtight, he said. Wire fraud, embezzlement, construction fraud, attempted guardianship fraud. We'll have the warrant by tonight. Tonight. Your 7-day investigation just gave us a prosecutable federal case. Everything documented, everything sourced, everything admissible. He pulled up a document on his screen. Saturday night, 8:15 p.m. Federal agents enter the venue during the contract signing. We'll coordinate with DOB for simultaneous building inspection. Inspector Fletcher, already briefed. He'll be there Saturday at 8 with technical scanning equipment. If that steel is what you say it is, the entire tower gets condemned on the spot. Harrison stood and extended his hand. Mr. Mercer, you've built one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I've seen in 20 years. Your son won't see freedom for a very long time. I shook his hand, feeling the weight of 7 days settle into something solid. From the FBI office, I drove to the Department of Buildings. Inspector Fletcher was waiting in his office, surrounded by structural engineering reports and material safety specifications. "I'll be there Saturday at 8 with the scanners," he said. "If that steel is what you say the tower's condemned, we'll evacuate immediately and post public notices. Every investor, every pre-lease tenant, every media outlet covering the inauguration will know the building is structurally unsound." "Everything you need is documented," I said, handing him a printed summary of the import manifests and budget discrepancies. He reviewed the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what structural failure meant. Grade 250 where grade 350 is required. $5 million embezzled from materials budget. He looked up at me. "Mr. Mercer, if this building had opened and people had moved in..." "I know. We'll make sure it doesn't." I walked out of the DOB office into Chicago sunlight, carrying nothing but felt lighter than I had in years. The trap was set. The evidence was delivered. The federal warrant was being processed. Inspector Fletcher would be there with scanning equipment. In 24 hours, Hugo's triumph would become his arrest. I drove home through Friday midday traffic, past the city I'd called home for 6 decades. Past the neighborhoods where my grandfather had bought land in the 1960s. Past the construction site where Hugo's tower stood against the skyline, a monument to fraud that would be condemned before Sunday morning. At home, I checked my encrypted message app. One new message from Lyle. Dossier confirmed delivered. Additional legal verification filed with federal court confirming all evidence obtained legally and admissible. A second message appeared as I was reading. Suspension worked. Ethics board closed preliminary investigation this morning. They're not watching anymore. No active monitoring. I'm free to move. A third message. Tomorrow I'm there as your friend, not your lawyer. No professional constraints. No ethics review. Just a man who's known you for 40 years watching justice happen. I smiled at my phone, the first real smile since Cleo's wrist broke. A final message came through. "One day left. Sleep well tonight, Vernon." I set my phone down and walked to my study window. Friday afternoon rush hour filled the streets below. Somewhere in that city, Hugo was celebrating what he thought was his victory. Lucille was planning her Saturday triumph. Saskia was probably packing her inauguration dress, preparing to stand beside Hugo while he signed the international contract that would save them all. None of them knew that in 24 hours, federal agents would be reading them their rights. None of them knew the building they'd be celebrating was about to be condemned. None of them knew that Vernon Mercer, the dismissed 60-year-old auditor they'd broken and humiliated, had spent 7 days building a case that would put them in federal prison for a decade or more. Friday afternoon, I stood at my study window watching Chicago's Friday rush hour, and for the first time in 7 days, I felt like I could breathe. Tomorrow morning, Hugo would wake up thinking he had one more day until his triumph. Tomorrow night, he'd be in federal custody. Saturday morning, I woke before dawn and sat beside Cleo's bed watching her sleep. The curtains filtered the first gray light into something soft. Her small hands rested on top of the quilt, the bandages gone now, replaced by pink scar tissue that would fade over months. She'd been drawing again yesterday, simple sketches, just circles and lines, but her face had lit up when the pencil moved without pain. Her eyes opened. She looked at me without surprise, as if she'd known I was there. "Is today special?" she asked. I nodded. "Today is the day everything changes." She sat up slowly, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. "Are you going to see Hugo?" "Yes." "Will the police come?" "Yes, at 8:15 tonight." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze steady on my face. Then she said, "I want to come with you." I'd expected this, feared it, and expected it in equal measure. "Cleo, you don't have to. You've already been through so much. I can do this part alone." "I know I don't have to." She held up her hands, turning them in the morning light. The faded bruises caught the pale glow. But beneath them, carefully folded the architectural sketch Cleo had drawn of the Global Children's Medical Fund building. The sketch she'd made with such hope before Hugo had ruined it, before he'd crushed her wrists with pliers as punishment for interfering. She held the gloves up, studying them. "I'm not going to wear these," she said. "I'm going to hold them, so everyone can see my hands and the gloves together, so they understand." I knelt in front of her, my vision blurring. "You're braver than I ever was." "You came back for me," she said simply. "That's the bravest thing." We spent the day in quiet preparation. I made her favorite lunch, grilled cheese with tomato soup. She drew at the kitchen table while I reviewed the timeline one final time, confirming Agent Harrison's text, "Warrant approved." Team assembles at 7:45 p.m., entry at 8:15 p.m. sharp. You have 45 minutes inside before we arrive. Use them wisely. 45 minutes to walk into Hugo's triumph and turn it into his reckoning. At 6:30 that evening, we got into the car. The drive to downtown took 20 minutes. Vance Luxury Tower rose against the sunset like a monument to excess, 32 stories of glass and steel, each floor sold for prices that could have funded Cleo's medical charity 10 times over. The inauguration had started at 6, and by the time we arrived at 7:30, the plaza was packed with guests in evening wear, television cameras, and a red carpet that stretched from the curb to the lobby entrance. I parked 2 blocks away. Cleo carried her small canvas bag, the pink gloves and sketch tucked inside. We walked toward the tower together, my hand on her shoulder. As we approached the plaza, heads began to turn. Cleo had her hands out in front of her, raised, slightly deliberately visible. The pink scar tissue caught the camera lights. In one hand, she held the silk gloves, unstained, perfect, a ghost of the childhood Hugo had stolen. In the other hand, she held the architectural sketch, its edges worn from folding and unfolding. The contrast was immediate and devastating. A 10-year-old girl with healing burn scars standing at the entrance of a luxury tower inauguration, holding symbols of wealth and wounded innocence side by side. Cameras swung toward us. Flashes erupted. A reporter called out, "Sir, is that child injured? What's she doing here?" Shh. I didn't answer. We kept walking toward the entrance. 2 security guards in black suits stepped forward, blocking the red carpet. One of them held up a hand. "Invitation only, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the document I'd been carrying since Friday morning. The official Department of Buildings suspension order, stamped and signed with Hugo's name listed as the subject of enforcement action. I handed it to the guard. "Hugo Mercer is operating under a suspended contractor license. This building's occupancy permit is invalid pending investigation. I'm here to deliver notice." The guard's eyes widened as he scanned the document. He looked at his partner, then back at me. Behind them, through the glass lobby doors, I could see Hugo standing near a champagne fountain, Saskia beside him in a gold dress, both of them laughing with investors and politicians, and everyone who'd helped him build this empire on stolen funds and broken lives. The guard lowered this document slowly. He looked at Cleo, at her raised hands and the gloves and the sketch, at the cameras now swarming around us. Then he looked back at me. "Let them through," he said quietly. He stepped aside. His partner did the same. Cleo and I walked forward, crossing the red carpet toward the glass doors. 30 minutes until Agent Harrison and his team arrived. 30 minutes until $200 million in fraud charges and child endangerment became public record. 30 minutes until Hugo's triumph turned to ash. I pushed open the door and we stepped inside. Hugo's voice filled the grand hall at 7:45, confident and commanding, while Cleo and I stood near the back watching. We'd moved through the lobby, past the champagne fountain, past the clusters of investors in evening wear, past Lucille Hampton directing staff with sharp gestures. No one had stopped us. The DOB suspension order in my pocket gave us more authority in this building than Hugo himself possessed, though he didn't know it yet. The Grand Hall occupied the entire second floor, 3,000 square feet of marble and glass with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. A stage had been erected at the far end, draped in white fabric with the Vance Development logo projected in gold light. Behind the stage hung a 50-foot LED screen, currently dark, waiting for the 8 o'clock presentation that would never happen the way Hugo planned. He stood at the podium in a navy suit that probably cost more than most families earned in a month. Saskia sat in the front row wearing the gold dress I'd glimpsed earlier, her expression serene and satisfied. Around them sat 24 investment fund representatives, international money, the kind that built empires or destroyed them depending on the quarterly returns. "This tower represents Chicago's future," Hugo said, his voice amplified through speakers mounted along the walls. "Bold, uncompromising, built on solid foundation. We've completed every inspection, exceeded every standard, and delivered a product that will stand for generations. Lies all of it. The foundation contained substandard Chinese steel that would fail within a decade. The inspections had been forged, the standards had been bypassed through bribes and shell companies, but his voice didn't waver. He believed his own mythology. Then he saw us. His gaze swept the room during a pause, a practiced gesture of confidence, and landed on Cleo and me standing near the entrance. I watched his face change, the smooth professional mask cracking for just a second. His eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly. Then he caught himself, forced the smile back into place, but his hand gripped the podium edge. "As I was saying," he continued, his voice slightly higher now, "we've completed all inspections." He stopped mid-sentence and made a small gesture with his left hand, a quick flick toward the security guards stationed along the walls. I'd expected this. He wanted us removed before we could disrupt his carefully orchestrated triumph. The guards didn't move. Hugo's hand flicked again, more insistent this time. Still nothing. One of the guards, a tall man in a black suit, met Hugo's eyes and gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. The DOB suspension order had been shared with building security an hour ago. They knew Hugo's authority here was nullified. They knew I carried legal standing he no longer possessed. Lucille leaned toward Saskia in the front row, whispering urgently. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read her lips well enough. Why is Vernon here? Get him out. Saskia's head turned. She saw Cleo, first the small figure in the blue dress, hands raised, slightly pink scars visible even from this distance. Then she saw me. Her expression went cold, calculating. She whispered something back to Lucille, then returned her gaze to Hugo, her face carefully neutral. Hugo cleared his throat and continued speaking, but the confidence had drained from his voice. Our partnership with Global Infrastructure Fund represents a milestone in Chicago development. The contracts we'll sign tonight at 8 o'clock will... He faltered again, glancing at the digital clock mounted on the wall above the LED screen. 7:58. 2 minutes until the master key activated. 2 minutes until everything he'd built collapsed in full view of everyone who mattered. I felt Cleo's hand slip into mine. Her palm was warm, the healed skin slightly rough where the burns had been deepest. She squeezed once, a small gesture of solidarity. Hugo stumbled through the final minute of his speech, his words coming faster now, less polished. The investors shifted in their seats, sensing something wrong but not yet understanding what. The clock above the screen changed to 7:59. 8 p.m. The screens went white, then filled with numbers. Every head in the room turned toward the 50-foot display. I'd programmed the master key to activate at exactly 8 o'clock, synchronized with Agent Harrison's timeline designed for maximum impact. The first image that appeared was a flowchart, crisp, professional, the kind of financial diagram these investors saw every day. Except this one traced $200 million through Delaware shell companies, offshore routing schemes, and forged signature chains that all led back to Hugo Mercer. The second screen mounted on the opposite wall flickered to life, showing a live feed from Inspector Neil Fletcher's equipment. The camera view showed the tower's foundation, steel beams visible through concrete cores, and a scanning device displaying red warnings, substandard material. Structural integrity compromised. Immediate evacuation recommended. Someone in the crowd gasped. Hugo stood frozen at the podium, his face drained of color. Then the audio started. My son's voice played through 200 speakers' mental institution. The recording I'd captured Thursday night filled the hall with perfect clarity. Hugo's voice unmistakable. The mental institution paperwork is ready for Monday. Once he's committed, I'll have full power of attorney. The house sale closes Wednesday. Saskia's recorded reply, and if Cleo interferes again, she won't. I've made sure she understands the consequences. The burn threat spoken aloud. The institutionalization plan public record now. The conspiracy to steal everything I'd built laid bare in Hugo's own words. The grand hall erupted. Investors stood shouting questions. Media cameras that had been positioned for the contract signing swung toward the screens, toward Hugo, toward the evidence displayed in irrefutable detail. Lucille grabbed Saskia's arm, pulling her toward a side exit, but Agent Grant Harrison stepped forward from where he'd been waiting near the entrance, federal badge raised. Hugo Mercer, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. You're under arrest for wire fraud and construction fraud. 2 more agents moved toward the stage. Hugo raised his hands not in surrender, but in a gesture of denial, his mouth forming words that made no sound. Saskia turned and saw the agents approaching, saw Inspector Fletcher entering with DOB officials, saw the exits blocked. A technician, one of the men I'd coordinated with yesterday, someone who'd helped install the master key knowing exactly what it would reveal, handed me the microphone. Dozens of Chicago newspaper cameras turned toward me and Cleo, the injured 10-year-old girl and the dismissed grandfather. Behind us on 50-foot screens, every dollar Hugo stole was documented. The foundation fraud, the offshore accounts, the institutional commitment papers, the recording of his voice planning my destruction. I raised the microphone. I spoke into the microphone like I was presenting an audit report because that's exactly what this was. The weight felt familiar, not so different from the presentation pointer I'd used for 40 years walking boards through balance sheets and discrepancy analyses. The chaos settled as my voice carried through the speakers, calm and methodical. Line item 1, I said, gesturing toward the screen where Cleo's medical records appeared. Physical assault on minor dependent, documented medically, photographed by Chicago Memorial Hospital. I turned and looked at Cleo. She understood immediately. She stood and raised her small hands, holding them up so the cameras could see. The pink scar tissue caught the light. 20 journalists leaned forward. Camera flashes erupted. No one spoke. Line item 2. I pointed to the flowchart of shell companies and offshore transfers. $41 million embezzled through Delaware entities, every transaction traced, every forged signature verified, every theft documented. The numbers scrolled past, precise and damning. I'd spent 60 hours over 3 weeks extracting this data cross-referencing bank records with tax filings. It was the most thorough audit I'd ever conducted. Line item 3. My voice hardened. $5 million in construction fraud using smuggled substandard steel. This building threatens every resident within 8 blocks. The foundation will fail. It's not a question of if, but when. Inspector Fletcher stepped forward, his DOB badge visible, holding a tablet displaying real-time structural analysis. The investors in the front rows stood and moved toward the exits. Someone shouted a question about liability. I didn't answer. I'd said what needed saying. The air tasted like expensive cologne mixed with fear. 200 people realizing they'd invested in fraud celebrated a crime. I could smell spilled champagne, hear the rustle of evening gowns as the crowd pressed toward the doors. Agent Harrison stepped onto the stage at exactly 8:15, flanked by 4 federal agents. Hugo Mercer, Saskia Mercer, you're under arrest for wire fraud, construction fraud, embezzlement, and child endangerment. Hugo stood pale and frozen near the podium, his mouth opening and closing without sound. 2 agents moved toward him with handcuffs. He didn't resist. He seemed incapable of movement, locked in place by complete collapse. Saskia tried to blend into the crowd, stepping back from the front row, her gold dress bright against the dark suits. But Harrison turned and looked directly at her. Saskia Mercer, separate warrant for child abuse and filing a false domestic violence accusation. She stopped mid-step. This is a mistake, I didn't... The agent nearest her took her arm, professional and firm. As he turned her toward the stage, her balance shifted. She stumbled slightly in her heels, reaching up instinctively. The movement dislodged the tiara she'd been wearing, silver crowns studded with what I'd learned from Lyle were cheap glass made to look expensive. The tiara hit marble and exploded into a dozen glass pieces that skittered across white stone. The sound echoed through the hall, sharp, final, the perfect symbol of everything Saskia had pretended to be. The cameras swung toward the shattered fragments. A journalist in the front row picked up one of the larger pieces, holding it to the light. Even from the stage, I could see it was hollow, weightless, worth nothing. Saskia stared at the broken crown, then let the agent guide her toward Hugo. They handcuffed them both side by side, the power couple reduced to defendants. Hugo's knees buckled. He sank onto the marble floor, his hands still cuffed behind his back, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, please," he said, looking up at me. "I'm still your son. The inheritance family, we can fix this. I'll pay everything back. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no satisfaction. Just hollow acknowledgement that this was necessary. Lyle stepped forward from near the entrance. He carried a leather folder containing the original trust documents, the ones my grandfather had drafted in 1945. The founder's trust included protective clause. Lyle said, his voice steady. He opened the folder and read from the yellowed pages. Any family member who physically or financially harms another member is immediately and irrevocably disinherited. All rights, properties, and holdings revert to the next eligible heir. He looked up and met Hugo's eyes. As of tonight, the entire estate belongs to Cleo Mercer. Hugo retains nothing. Everything. Hugo had nothing left. The room absorbed this in stages. First, the legal team members who understood immediately. Then the investors calculating Hugo's total loss of collateral. Then the media recognizing the narrative arc, Golden Sun Falls orphaned granddaughter inherits everything. Hugo made a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like air being forced from his lungs. His face crumpled. He bent forward until his forehead touched the cold marble, his shoulders shaking. I looked away and scanned the room. In the far corner near the service entrance, Lucille Hampton stood with her phone in her hand and her expression carefully blank. Our eyes met for just a second. She'd been Hugo's architect, his enabler, the one who'd managed the shell companies and forged the documents. She turned and walked out without a single word, disappearing into the hallway beyond. I made a mental note to pass her information to Harrison. She'd be arrested by Monday. The grand hall emptied fast. Investors fleeing, association media clustering for statements, federal agents securing the scene. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline glittered indifferent and eternal. I set down the microphone on the podium and turned away from Hugo, still kneeling on the marble. At the far end of the grand hall, Cleo stood holding her architectural sketch for the Global Fund, the tower she'd dreamed of building before her wrist was broken. The drawing showed clean lines and green spaces, a structure designed for healing instead of greed. I walked toward her. Sunday morning light came through the kitchen windows, brighter than I remembered seeing it all week. I stood at the stove, cracking eggs into a pan, the smell of butter and coffee filling the Lincoln Square kitchen. Cleo sat at the table behind me, sketching architectural designs on printer paper, her hand moving easily now, the wrist healed enough to hold a pencil without pain. We'd left the grand hall just after 9 last night, walking past the federal agents and the cameras and the shattered glass from Saskia's tiara. We'd driven home in silence. Cleo had fallen asleep in the car. The eggs sizzled. I flipped them carefully, added salt and pepper, slid them onto 2 plates beside toast, and sliced strawberries. Simple food, the kind of breakfast I used to make for my sons 40 years ago. Scrambled or over easy, I asked. Over easy, Cleo said without looking up from her drawing. The yolk is the best part. I set her plate down and she smiled, picked up her fork with her right hand, the one that had been broken, and cut into the egg. Golden yolk spilled across the white plate. She took a bite and made a small, satisfied sound. My phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Chicago Child Protective Services. I answered and stepped into the hallway. Mr. Mercer, this is Officer Diane Caldwell, 42 Senior Investigator with CPS. We spoke 3 weeks ago regarding the allegations. Her voice was professional, but warmer than I remembered from our first conversation when she'd arrived at my door with questions and a legal pad. I remember, I said. I'm calling to inform you that all charges are officially withdrawn. Dr. Ross's medical documentation was conclusive. The evidence showed your granddaughter's injuries occurred while in your son's custody, not yours. The anonymous report has been traced and verified as legitimate concern, but the subsequent investigation cleared you completely. I closed my eyes and leaned against the hallway wall. 3 weeks of that weight lifted in a single sentence. Thank you, I said. You're a good grandfather, Mr. Mercer. Cleo is lucky to have you. She hung up. I stood there for a moment longer, phone in hand, letting the relief settle. When I returned to the kitchen, Cleo had finished her eggs and was back to sketching. I sat down across from her with my own plate. Who called? She asked. The people who were checking to make sure you were safe. They said everything is fine now, no more questions. She nodded her pencil, moving across the paper in careful lines. Then she looked up. Grandpa, can we get Dad's bracelet back from Hugo's house? The silver memorial bracelet. The one thing I'd wanted to recover, the one piece of my younger son that Cleo had kept close since the funeral. Hugo had taken it from her dresser drawer weeks ago, sold it or melted it or thrown it away out of spite. No, sweetheart, I said quietly. That's gone. Some things we can't get back. Her face fell. She looked down at her sketch, her pencil still. Even with all the legal stuff, even with the arrests. Even then, the bracelet is lost. I'm sorry. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her pencil again and added another line to her drawing, a building with clean edges and wide windows, the kind of structure that let light in instead of keeping it out. Then I'll draw it, she said. I'll draw Dad's bracelet so I don't forget what it looked like, and when I'm older I'll build something he would have liked. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. A week had passed between the Grand Hall collapse and this quiet law office, between public destruction and private rebuilding. Lyle's office occupied the 3rd floor of a renovated brownstone in the Loop, all dark wood and leather chairs and shelves lined with legal volumes. He sat behind his desk with the trust documents spread out in front of him, reading glasses perched on his nose. Cleo and I sat across from him in chairs that were too large for her, her feet dangling above the carpet. The court has officially enforced the Founder's Protective Clause, Lyle said, looking up at me. You did it, Vernon. Complete disinheritance. All Vance family assets and Chicago land holdings transfer to Cleo Mercer's name under your trust management until she turns 25. He slid a document across the desk. I scanned the legal language, the list of properties and accounts and holdings that now belong to my granddaughter, the house in Lincoln Square, the original family land, the commercial properties my grandfather had purchased in the 1940s, everything Hugo had tried to steal, everything Saskia had tried to claim, all of it secured for Cleo. The founder built protections into the trust 80 years ago, I said. I just enforced them. Lyle smiled for the first time since his voluntary suspension, justice and friendship both intact. Your grandfather knew what he was doing when he wrote that clause. He understood family could be dangerous. Cleo looked between us, her expression uncertain. Does this mean Hugo can't hurt us anymore? She asked. Lyle turned to her, his voice gentle. That's exactly what it means. Legally, financially, he has no power over you or your grandfather. Everything that was his now belongs to you. What about the tower he built? Condemned, being demolished next month. The foundation was structurally unsound. She nodded, slowly processing this. Then she looked at me. Can I use the money to build the medical fund like I drew? When you're older, I said. When you're ready, the money will wait. Lyle pushed the signature page toward her, offering a pen. Just here, Cleo, your legal name. She took the pen, carefully gripping it the way children do when they're still learning cursive. She pressed it against the signature line, her tongue between her teeth in concentration. Her name appeared in wobbly 10-year-old script, Cleo Mercer, owner. Below it, in small print, Vance Family Trust Estate, Chicago Land Holdings. Total value $127 million. 6 months after the inauguration collapse, I sat in federal court watching the judge sentence my son to 12 years in prison. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor polish, institutional and impersonal. Cleo sat beside me in the gallery wearing a navy dress Lyle had helped me pick out something appropriate for witnessing justice. Her hands rested in her lap, the scars from the pliers faded to thin pink lines across her palms. She'd asked if she needed to come today. I'd told her the choice was hers. She'd chosen to see this through to the end. Judge Margaret Holloway, 63, a federal appointee with 30 years on the bench, looked down at Hugo from her elevated position. He stood between two federal marshals in an orange jumpsuit, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. Nothing remained of the confident developer who'd stood on that stage 6 months ago promising Chicago's future. Hugo Mercer, the judge said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. You are hereby sentenced to 12 years federal imprisonment without possibility of early parole for wire fraud, trust embezzlement, and construction fraud. You will serve this sentence at a facility to be determined by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Hugo's head dropped. He didn't speak, didn't turn to look at me or Cleo or anyone in the gallery. The marshals took his arms and led him toward the side door. He shuffled rather than walked, a defeated man disappearing into institutional custody. I felt nothing watching him led away, just empty finality. The judge turned to Saskia, who stood at a separate defense table wearing a gray suit that looked expensive but no longer fit properly. 6 months of stress had changed her. Her lawyer, a young man who'd tried his best with an impossible case, stood rigid beside her. Saskia Mercer, concurrent sentences for child abuse and filing false domestic violence accusations. 8 years federal imprisonment. Saskia's face crumpled. She made a small sound, quickly suppressed. Her lawyer touched her shoulder briefly before the female marshal stepped forward with handcuffs. The judge consulted her notes. Vance Luxury Tower assets are permanently frozen and will be liquidated to compensate defrauded investors. Lucille Hampton remains under separate federal investigation for offshore account connections in the Cayman Islands. She paused, then looked directly at me. Regarding the minor child Tristan Mercer, age 6, the court has placed him in neutral guardianship with the foster family unconnected to this case. Mr. Vernon Mercer has specifically requested the child not be exposed to further family conflict. Cleo glanced up at me, understanding in her eyes. Tristan was Hugo and Saskia's son, my other grandson, an innocent child who'd done nothing wrong. I wouldn't perpetuate the cycle of harm across another generation. He deserved safety and distance from all of this. The judge struck her gavel once. Court is adjourned. The courtroom was institutional justice. The silversmith shop was personal healing. We drove from the federal courthouse to Lincoln Square in the early December darkness, the city lights reflecting off recent snow. Cleo had been quiet since the sentencing, processing what she'd witnessed. I didn't push conversation. Sometimes silence was appropriate. I parked outside a small shop on Lincoln Avenue, its window displaying handcrafted jewelry and metalwork. A wooden sign above the door read, Brennan Silversmith, established 1967. I'd found this place 3 weeks ago through Lyle's recommendation, looking for someone who could do precise custom work. Where are we? Cleo asked. Somewhere important, I said. The shop bell chimed as we entered. The space was small and warm, smelling of metal polish and old wood. Display cases lined the walls, showing rings and bracelets and necklaces, all handmade, each piece unique. Behind the counter stood Arthur Brennan, 71, a master craftsman who'd learned silversmithing from his father and spent 5 decades perfecting the trade. He had weathered hands and careful eyes, the kind of person who measured worth in precision rather than profit. Mr. Mercer, he said, recognizing me from my previous visit. Right on time. He looked at Cleo with a gentle curiosity. And this must be the young lady. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside was a piece of paper I'd kept hidden for 6 months, waiting for the right moment. Cleo's aunt, Eleanor, her late father's sister, had given it to me years ago. Something she'd saved from when my younger son was an architecture student, before he'd met Cleo's mother, before he'd built his career, before the accident that took his life. This was her father's first architectural drawing, I said, handing the envelope to Mr. Brennan. From college. Can you engrave it on a bracelet? He opened the envelope carefully and slid out the yellowed sketch. It showed a simple building design, clean lines, careful measurements, the precise hand of someone learning the fundamentals. In the corner, in younger handwriting, first assignment, professor said I have potential. Mr. Brennan held it up to his workbench light, studying the lines. Of course, he said quietly. Beautiful work, very precise lines. Cleo stepped closer to the counter, looking at the sketch for the first time. Her breath caught. She'd never seen her father's early work, never known he'd started the same way she was starting now, with careful sketches and dreams of building something meaningful. Cleo didn't ask why the sketch mattered, she just held tighter. She turned to me and wrapped her arms around my waist, pressing her face against my coat. I felt her shoulders shake slightly, not with sadness but with understanding. This wasn't replacement for the lost memorial bracelet. This was acknowledgement that some losses are permanent, but memory can be carried forward in new forms. "The original bracelet is gone," I said softly, my hand on her head. "But your father's work remains. His talent lives in you now." She nodded against my coat, not speaking. Mr. Brennan set the sketch down carefully on his workbench. "I'll need 2 weeks for the engraving. The detail work requires time to do properly." "Take whatever time you need," I said. He looked at the sketch again, then at Cleo, who'd stepped back to wipe her eyes with her sleeve. His gaze settled on her hands, small, still showing faint scars from the pliers, but holding strength that couldn't be measured in physical terms. "The person who drew this has very special hands," Mr. Brennan said, glancing meaningfully at Cleo's scarred palms. He held the sketch up to the light once more, studying the careful architectural lines Cleo's father had drawn 20 years before his death. "Very special hands," he repeated. In Cleo's hands, still healing but holding a pencil again, her father's talent lived on. 3 years is a long time to carry something before you set it down. I didn't realize I'd been carrying it until the morning I stopped. A Tuesday in late October, ordinary in every way that matters. Gray sky, cold, coffee. Cleo's backpack by the front door, the Lincoln Square house, making its usual sounds of pipes and old wood settling. I was standing at the kitchen counter, reading nothing in particular, when it occurred to me that I hadn't checked the encrypted message app in 11 days. Not because I'd forgotten, because there was nothing left to check. The app was still on my phone. I opened it out of habit and found what I'd known I'd find: nothing new. Lyle's last message was dated 11 days prior, confirming the final trust document had cleared federal review. Before that, Agent Harrison's sign-off on the case. Before that, Inspector Fletcher's condemnation notice on the tower, 3 lines of bureaucratic language that ended Hugo's construction empire permanently and protected thousands of families from living inside a building built on stolen money and substandard steel. I deleted the app, not dramatically, not with any ceremony. I just held the icon for 2 seconds, tapped delete, and put the phone in my pocket. Then I finished my coffee and drove Cleo to school. She was 13 now. The girl who'd walked through my door wearing pink silk gloves to hide her wrists was gone, replaced by someone I was still learning to fully see: a person with opinions about structural load distribution and strong feelings about which Chicago neighborhoods had been architecturally neglected. Someone who read building permit filings the way other teenagers read social media and thought nothing of it. She'd inherited that from me without asking permission. The youth architecture mentorship program had been running for 8 months. Her mentor, Clara Shen, called me periodically with updates that were less updates and more quiet expressions of professional astonishment. Most recently, she'd called to tell me that Cleo had presented a community health facility design to a panel of licensed architects and answered every technical question without notes, without hesitation, without performing confidence she didn't have. "She knows when she doesn't know something," Clara had said. "She says so directly instead of guessing. Do you know how rare that is? In a 13-year-old or in general?" I'd asked. A pause. Both. I'd told Clara about Hugo once briefly because Cleo had referenced it herself during a design critique. She'd been explaining why she'd built structural redundancy into a building's load-bearing system, multiple reinforcements so that if one element failed, the whole thing wouldn't come down. A student had asked why she thought about failure so much. She'd answered without drama, "Because I've seen what happens when something important is built on a foundation that was designed to look solid, but wasn't." Clara had called me that evening. I gave her enough of the story to explain the comment, not all of it, just the load-bearing parts. "She turned it into a design philosophy," Clara said quietly. "She turned everything into something useful," I said. "That's who she is." The phone call came on a Wednesday morning while Cleo was at school. A counselor from the Federal Correctional Facility in Vandalia, Illinois. A young man's voice, careful and practiced the tone of someone who'd delivered this kind of message before and understood the weight of it. Hugo had submitted a letter request. Not his first, the third over the course of 18 months, each one declined by the facility pending recipient consent. 4 pages, the counselor said. No demands in it, no requests beyond acknowledgement. He just wanted to know it arrived. I stood at my study window while the counselor spoke. The October street below was bare of leaves now, the elms stripped clean by 2 weeks of wind. A woman I didn't recognize was walking a large gray dog past the front of my house, and the dog paused at the bottom of my steps for a moment before being guided forward. "Mr. Mercer," the counselor said, "do you want to take some time to decide?" "No," I said. "Forward it." "And shall I let him know it was received?" I thought about my son in a room 200 miles away waiting. I thought about Hugo on his marble steps recording my rage on a phone, smiling at the camera quality. I thought about Hugo at the podium 6 months later, his face draining of color as the screens filled with evidence of everything he'd stolen. I thought about Hugo's forehead on the grand hall floor, his shoulders shaking. 3 years. He'd spent 3 years in a room he couldn't leave. "Tell him I received it," I said, "and tell him I read it." "You haven't read it yet, sir?" "I will," I said. "Tell him I will." The counselor confirmed and ended the call. I set the phone on my desk and looked at the study wall where I'd once spread trust documents and Delaware Shell Company registrations and forged land transfer signatures across every available surface building the case that dismantled Hugo's empire piece by piece. The wall was bare now. I'd painted over it in September, a clean, pale gray that held the morning light without asking anything of it. The letter arrived on Friday. 4 pages handwritten on lined institutional paper, Hugo's handwriting smaller and more careful than I remembered it. He'd always written with the large, confident strokes of a man who assumed his signature mattered. This handwriting was different, deliberate, considered like someone practicing penmanship because they had nothing but time and had decided to use it well. I read it once at my desk. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside the velvet box holding Cleo's new bracelet, the one Mr. Brennan had engraved with her father's first architectural sketch, the one I'd given her 6 months ago in the silversmith shop on Lincoln Avenue. I didn't tell Cleo about the letter that evening. I didn't decide yet whether I would write back. Some decisions deserve to remain open longer than the urgency of the moment suggests. 40 years as an auditor had taught me that the worst errors came from closing accounts before all the transactions had cleared. Hugo's account was still processing, so was mine. That Friday evening, Cleo and I ate dinner at the kitchen table the way we always did, her sketchbook open beside her plate pencil, moving between bites, the architecture sharing space with the food without apology. She was refining a detail on the community health facility, the same corner she'd been working on for 2 weeks. "The entrance ramp," she said without preamble. "I want it to be the main entrance, not a side accommodation, the primary way in." "Then it has to be designed first," I said, "not added after." "That's what Clara said." She looked up. "Why do people always design the ramp last?" "Because they design for who they assume will use the building," I said, "not for everyone who might." She wrote something in the margin of her sketch. Then she looked at me with the particular directness she'd developed over the past year, the expression that meant she was about to say something she'd been holding for a while. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" I set down my fork. "Why do you ask?" "You've been quiet since this morning. Different quiet, not your regular thinking quiet." She tilted her head slightly. Something happened. 13 years old, and she could read the spaces between my expressions the way I'd spent 40 years reading the spaces between numbers. I didn't know whether to be proud or humbled. I settled on both. "Someone called from the facility where Hugo is," I said. "He wrote a letter. I said they could send it." She was quiet for a moment. Her pencil rested still on the page. "What did it say?" "Things I need to think about before I can explain them properly." She nodded, accepting this. She understood the difference between information that was ready to be shared and information still being processed. She'd learned it from watching me work 3 years of seeing a man who never spoke before he was sure. "Okay," she said. Then she picked up her pencil and added a line to the entrance ramp, a long, generous curve, wide enough for 2, designed as if it had always been the obvious way in. I watched her draw and thought about foundations, about what holds when someone tries to take out the base, about what you build after the collapse and how the second structure is always different from the first, quieter, less certain of itself, more honest about the weight it carries. Hugo was 200 miles away, learning the dimensions of institutional walls. Cleo was here, learning the dimensions of buildings designed for everyone. Somewhere between those two facts was the distance we'd traveled, and I was still measuring it. But the kitchen was warm. The drawing was careful. The ramp curved toward its entrance in a long, patient arc. That was enough for tonight. And to you listening to my story, remember this: age and patience are not weaknesses. Looking back, I wish I had seen the warning signs earlier. I should have questioned Hugo's finances years before Cleo got hurt. If you've read other family Reddit stories like mine, you know that family betrayal revenge starts with documentation. Don't make my mistake of trusting family blindly just because they share your blood. When someone shows you who they really are through their actions, believe them the first time. The lesson from this family betrayal revenge is simple. Institutional systems can be your greatest weapons when you know how to use them. I spent 40 years as an auditor learning those systems. When my family needed protection, those skills became my armor. I believe God gives us the tools we need long before we know we'll need them. He prepared me for this battle decades in advance. You hear many family Reddit stories about betrayal, but what sets justice apart from vengeance is using the system correctly. Family betrayal revenge works best when it's calculated, documented, and lawful. What would you have done in my situation? I know these family Reddit stories bring up strong emotions. Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share it with them. And if you want more stories about standing up for family when it matters most, subscribe to Dad's Silent Revenge. Thank you for staying until the very end. I truly appreciate you being here. One last note, this story contains fictionalized elements created for narrative and reflection. What matters is the message and the lessons we can all take from it.